Hey guys, how all of you beautiful people are doing? And yes, this is a next part of Naruto's Shadow Clones Army. WIP An unconscious Iruka forces Naruto to return to the academy for another year. It also marks the beginnings of a prank whose far-reaching consequences will shake Konoha to its foundations. So let's start without any delay. Prank Day 176. Naruto slowly came to. Everything was blurry and distorted, and even with his eyes open he couldn't make sense of things. Luckily it seemed like whatever was causing this was fading, as his sight started clearing up. He shook his head side to side, hoping it would help. "Welcome back," he heard somewhat bizarrely. After a second of thought, he recognized Myomuru's voice and turned in that direction. It didn't take long for the remaining fuzziness to clear up, and he moved his head around, trying to get a better grasp on the situation. His arms were stuck behind his back, clearly chained, and a look downward revealed his feet were restrained similarly. Also, surprisingly, his shirt had been taken off and paper seals had been placed all over his belly. "What?" he asked aloud. "Yeah," Iruka replied, "that was my first reaction too." She was chained on the opposite side of the room, right next to the other clone. "You clearly went through a different treatment than we did," she continued, indicating her hands with a movement of her head. Her fingers had been taped together tightly in front of her, while her arms were chained with solid iron links which were bolted to the wall at her back. A quick look at Myomru revealed he'd gone through the same treatment. Naruto wriggled his fingers and found no obstructions. "Any ideas why they didn't do the same with my own hands?" he asked. "No clue," Myomru replied. "I can see seals on the chains at your feet," Iruka answered. "Those on your arms are probably the same. I guess you're the one who got the special treatment, not us." "Why would I?" Naruto started. "Oh, yeah. Kuibai." He normally didn't pay much attention to his tenant, but others might not do the same. The other two clones nodded in agreement. "Probably," Myomru answered. There was a moment of silence. "Well, anyway, we don't have time to lose," Naruto said. "Any clue where we are?" Iruka shook her head. "None. By what I can remember, you were the last one who lost consciousness, and the both of us were already chained here when we woke up." "What about Ishibo?" the blonde asked. Iruka made a move with her head, indicating one of the corners of the room. Twisting so he could look in that direction, he noticed the rabbit standing in that corner, immobile. He was restrained as heavily as anybody else in this cell, and didn't react when his name was called. "Is he okay?" Naruto asked. "I'm pretty sure he's still under the effect of what took us down," Iruka replied, a note of uncertainty creeping in her voice. "Any clue what it was?" Myomru added. Naruto thought back, trying to remember what had happened earlier. "I think," he said. "I think he said it was a poison of some sort." "Poison?" Myomru echoed, surprised. "Aren't we clones immune to poison?" That was at least the general idea, especially based on the clones' resistance to alcohol. "That's what I thought also," Naruto replied. "It's not like we'd tested that part, however." At those words, the two clones looked down. Believing themselves immune was dangerous, especially if they weren't. "Anyway," Naruto continued, "that's not important right now. What is getting out of here, and as soon as possible." "And how are we going to do that?" Myomru said, rattling his chains. "We can't do hand seals, we barely have any leeway to move and we're chained to the very walls." Said walls were stone, and looked very sturdy. How can we manage that? Naruto nodded, face serious. Then, let's figure out what we can do without hand seals. Anything comes to mind? Well, Iruka said from her spot. There's already a few things. Mostly chakra exercises, but Hara coil, 3.4. Diaphragm coil 3.1. Central lung coil 3.7. That and the sound of a quill on paper were the only things Ebisu could hear as he came to. Since he had no clue where he was, he did his best not to react in any way, keeping his eyes closed as he cast his mind back to how he'd gotten here. The last thing he remembered was following the lawman back to his office. He'd been on edge, he couldn't tell what, but some instinct was telling him things weren't as he'd suspected. Still, the lawman made no offensive move, leading him directly to his office and withdrawing the requested documents from his desk. The special Jonin remembered that he'd not even touched the documents, preferring to use a variation of the leaf floating method to grab them. The first was what had been requested, and he'd fallen while reaching for the second. He couldn't think of anything else. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Ninja-san, a voice came from above. "I was starting to think you had an uncommon reaction to my poison. The antidote normally works much quicker." Ebisu could hear the smile in the man's voice. "Though, I will suggest that you should train your body more, Ninja-san. I've rarely had a high-level ninja with such a weak body pass through my hands." Ebisu opened his eyes to find a man standing right above him. He had short white blonde hair that was slicked back and ended at his nape, along with a bizarre seal right in the middle of his forehead. He wore an open white lab coat with casual clothes underneath, nothing that especially drew attention. No, what immediately drew the eyes were the glasses he wore. Steel gray, they were nearly a half mask with how much of his face they covered. Also, one couldn't see his eyes through the lenses, and not because they were tinted. No, the effect was similar to a microscope, distorting the eye beneath. "I'm sorry, I haven't introduced myself," the man said cheerfully. "My name is Shinsuke Shuken, and this place is my very own lab." Ebisu tried rising, only to fail as bands of metal held him down. "What am I doing here?" he asked. "You are here to help the advancement of knowledge, of course," Shuken replied with a smile, sounding as if such a thing was self-evident. "We don't get many Konoha shinobi here, but your fire nature will be perfect for many tests." The blonde's hands formed into seals. "Now, please stay still. We wouldn't want to generate invalid data, would we?" Ebisu's eyes went wide. "You're a ninja." There had been no indication of such a thing, no hitei, no weapons or armor. Not even the classic scars and other bodily consequences of shinobi life. "Never call me that," the man spat out, his cheerful demeanor vanishing in an instant. "I'm a chakra scientist, not one of those stupid brutes that care only about money and violence." He put his hand on the immobile Ebisu's throat, and paralyzed the special Jonin from the throat down. "None of them care about research, progress or anything like that. They only care about killing each other off." He stooped for a second. "There are exceptions, though, such as my own sensei. Thank the kami for them, or humanity would have killed itself off by now." It didn't take long for Ebisu to guess who the man's sensei was. "You work for Orochimaru," the special Jonin spat out accusingly. Shuken didn't notice the tone. "Great man, isn't he?" he replied. "He might have started as a ninja, but he's really like me, a scientist at heart. He understands what's truly important, and that sacrifices have to be made in the name of science." He grabbed something to the side, and shoved it into Abisu's mouth. He then tied it off solidly. MMPH. The special Jonin grunted, his words made incomprehensible by the plastic ball between his teeth. I'm sorry, but I have to test your brain's pain response now. We need to have everything noted down before we proceed to the next batch of tests, you see. The scientist grabbed a blade tool from a tray beside the table. Now, let's. Almost there, Naruto said as he watched the proceedings. Myoru inched his foot forward as Iruka forced herself to stay immobile. It took 3 tries, but he finally managed to hook his foot right where he wanted. Got it, the male clone said. Just a little more. He pushed his foot forward a tiny bit, forcing Iruka's side pocket open millimeter by millimeter. So? Iruka asked hopefully. Myoru let his foot fall back down. Nothing. Pockets empty. Damn. Naruto swore. That's another thing out. Anything else? The 3 Narutos had spent the last hour trying to figure out ways of escaping their chains, listing things they could do without hand seals. Unfortunately, they hadn't gotten any results yet. The Academy's escape techniques weren't enough for solid chains like these. Both the leaf floating technique and the chakra shield didn't affect the bandages that were preventing them from using Justu, and while they might be able to prime tags without their hands, their captors had not forgotten to remove every weapon they had on themselves. Naruto himself was even unable to use chakra, which was either because of the seals on his stomach or the chains on his limbs. This wouldn't have been such an issue if they'd had some clone backup available. Unfortunately, the 3 Narutos had taken Ibisu's warning seriously, and hadn't used any ninjutsu since entering Fumotocho. Not that it would have mattered since, with the low population of the city, the clones would have been evident from the start. I can't think of much, Iruka replied. Only thing left that comes to mind is the tree walking technique. That's the opposite of what we want, Naruto said with a sigh. We want to make things leave, not make them stick. Myoru's eyes went wide at those words. I'm an idiot, he said, causing the others to turn towards him. Clearly focusing, he started channeling chakra to his fingers. What are you trying to do? Iruka asked. Myoru didn't answer, continuing to concentrate. A ripping sound echoed through the room, followed by another, then another. After a minute of such sounds, Myoru spread his fingers wide, then let them flow into a familiar pattern. He then disappeared from his spot, appearing on the other side of the room. Naked. Oops, he said as he looked down. I think I left too much behind. He then walked back to the chains to withdraw his shirt and pants. How did you do that? Both Naruto and Iruka asked. You remember Kiritri's lesson on the tree walking technique, right? He answered as he dressed himself. The 2 others nodded. Remember what happens if you put too much chakra into the technique? It damages the. Naruto said, then realized what the male clone had meant. Right. He looked down and tried channeling chakra once more. Nothing happened. Doesn't work with what I have, he said with a sigh. Not surprising, Myoru said as he made sure everything was properly in place. Beside him, tears were already appearing in Iruka's restraints. We'll help you out as soon as Iruka's free. The boy then went to help his female compatriot escape. It didn't take long before she was free, even managing to use Kawarimi while leaving only the chains behind. She then quickly went to the corner where Ishibo was staying, and stripped him of his bindings. That done, she put a hand on his chest and slowly smiled. He's fine, she revealed, placing the rabbit on her head. Both Naruto and Myoru released a sigh of relief at those words. That was one less thing to worry about. How about my chains? The blonde asked. The paper seals weren't an issue, but removing those didn't allow Naruto to escape as the other two had. The two clones tried everything from replacement techniques to wind chakra, but, in the end, they were forced to melt the chains and manacles down with a Kairaka Jigaku. Doing so unfortunately took time as they had to be careful, which meant it was another hour before the seals had melted enough for Naruto to escape. Now what, boss? Myoru asked. Normally, he wouldn't be calling Naruto that, but this was nothing close to a normal situation, and the three of them were alone here. We're getting out of this cell and finding Sensei. Any issue with that? He asked. The two clones shook their heads. It's quite possible he's already been captured, Iruka added. Naruto nodded. Since Konoha genin teams were always attached to a more experienced ninja, common sense would be to go after the jonin first. Anyway, I'm filling this place with clones. If Sensei is inside, we'll find him. If not, I'm pretty sure we'll draw enough attention that he'll come around soon enough. You know that's gonna draw the attention of every enemy in this place, right? Myoru asked. Fine by me, the blonde genin answered with a bloodthirsty grin. I'm not gonna hold back, not now. With what's happening in the village and Sensei missing, there's definitely some backsides in need of kicking. You two with me? Always, Iruka said, while Myoru nodded. One cross seal later, a dozen more Naruto appeared in the room. Seconds later, a stream of fire melted the lock that was holding them prisoner, and all of them rushed out. Let's go, people! Naruto yelled, and was answered by battle cries from the rest of his team. You really should take care of yourself better, you know, Shuken said as he finished with another medical scanning technique. Your liver's resistance to toxins is downright pathetic for a career shinobi. Ebisu resisted the urge to yell once more. Not only was he tied to a table, stripped near naked, and analyzed like a piece of meat, but his tormentor had the gall to complain about just about everything regarding his body. Yes, he knew he wasn't the example of physical perfection that his teammate Guy was, but having it pointed out to his face in clinical terms was pouring salt on the wounds. Still, with the gag in place, there wasn't much he could do anyway. The special jonin heard the door open, and then the clack of wood on tile. He recognized the sound, that was the innkeeper's leg, for certain. Ebisu realized that they'd been in the enemy's lair from the start, and hadn't noticed. He mentally swore at himself, he should have been more careful. Master, the genin have escaped, the innkeeper said as he advanced. The door was forced and the alarms rang. Really? Shuken replied. He looked at the side, where Ebisu could see a clock from the corner of his eyes. They should still be unconscious, and for at least 5 more hours. You did restrain the lot of them like I told you. Yes, he said, then recited his orders. Both pairs of chakra seals on the blonde boy. 8 chakra siphons on his stomach along with 4 coil blockers, placed as you directed. The other 2 were tied like every other ninja we've captured. One of them must have some special bloodline technique or something, the scientist replied. He'd only done a cursory scan of their chakra and nothing else, he should have done deeper tests. No matter. Release all the experiments, that should take care of them. Which suit do you want? I'll take the last Earth one, it's the best you've gotten me since my first. Ebisu could hear the raw satisfaction there was in those words. He didn't know what they meant by suits, but he wasn't looking to find out. Let me just stop things here and I'll transfer you. The scientist then turned to Ebisu. I'm sorry, but duty calls. Don't worry, I'll be back later for more tests. We'll have some good times together, you and I. MMPH. Ebisu tried yelling as the man's chakra-enhanced palm reached for his face, but once more the gag stopped him. He wanted nothing to do with the man's tests, and questioned the sanity of anyone who thought otherwise. Then fingers touched his brow and he knew no more. The place was a complete labyrinth. Running down long corridors with barely enough light, the three Narutos felt it was a little like being inside the Iruka tunnels. Those tunnels, however, didn't have side rooms every few dozens meters. Up until now, the group had found only cells, with nothing worse inside than a dead rat. Still, they checked everything. It wouldn't do to miss Ebisu's cell simply because they'd skipped one or two. Incoming. One of the clones scouting ahead of the pack said before diving to the side. Still, that didn't help as a claw swipe burst him as the enemy passed by. It wasn't anything the Naruto clones had seen before. It had a wolf's head on a gorilla's body, with a crocodile's tails and way too many arms. 6 of them to be exact, with 3 different pairs. All the pieces were attached together by bizarre black thread, crudely stitched in a way that shouldn't work, but still did. The clones in front didn't wait, charging 3 at the time. 2 died before doing anything, but the last managed to electrocute the beast before disappearing. It fell down in a heap, dead on the spot. Well, Myoru said as Naruto generated another dozen Kichibunshin. That wasn't so tough. Not 4 seconds after those words, another patchwork chimera rushed down the corridor. This one got no farther than the previous one, taking 3 clones with it. Another 2 creatures ran forward screaming before it even hit the floor. Defensive formation. Naruto yelled, creating more copies. He then stepped back as Bunshin formed protective lines in front of the Genin team. Against them, wave after wave of unnatural beasts pushed forward, biting and clawing everything in their way. The situation quickly became a stalemate. On one side, the monstrous beasts seemed endless and ever different, while on the other Naruto used the side rooms to summon more clones, bolstering the lines. The fact that the corridor was barely 2 meters wide meant that the numbers that could effectively fight were limited, and the lack of ranged weapons, or time to prepare more powerful techniques, made it so the clones were the ones doing all the fighting. Simple punches and kicks weren't enough, and they hadn't been able to retrieve their weapons as of yet. This bloody, close fighting went on for more than 5 minutes before one of the clones found a better way. Instead of directly taking the charge of some bizarre bear/bull/tiger mix, he dodged to the side, climbing up the wall to stay outside the creature's reach. He then jumped on its back and shocked the creature before being dispelled by the lightning technique. Follow that example, Naruto yelled. Luckily for the group, the first who did so was a clone trying to rush over the enemy lines. As soon as he was above the combat, he took an arrow to the knee and turned to smoke. What? Iruka cried out. None of that, Shinobi-san, an unknown voice echoed over the beastly howls. It came from somewhere between 2 of the lights, making the source invisible in the dark. I'm sorry to say, but the curfew is in effect. You should all return to your rooms to sleep some more. Who are you? Naruto yelled back. What, you don't recognize me? The voice answered, a hint of a smirk clearly audible. You kids, you make an old man sad. Old man? Myoru replied, perplexed. And that's the third, the voice answered. Myoru, was it? How do you know? the male clone yelled back. You'd be surprised at what an innkeeper hears, kid, the voice said. Well, good night all. At that, something shattered right over the heads of the genin. All three jumped to the side, expecting an explosive, but nothing like that came. You missed, Naruto retorted victoriously. Oh, did I? Naruto's elation was short-lived, as Myoru and Iruka fell right beside him. His knees failing, he forced himself to cross his arms, channeling all that he could into what might be his last technique. Kichibunshin no Jutsu. He yelled, only for the floor to welcome him back into darkness. Naruto was unfortunately more of a doer than a thinker. That was why, when faced with a dangerous situation, he tended to act instead of doing the smart thing, like informing the rest of the network of the latest happenings. As it often did, this meant that all the clones had only been updated once the first Bunshin fell in battle. Not the way one preferred learning about a situation. Of course, orders had been dispatched quickly. Konoha, who had the most experience leading troops during such a situation, had quickly given orders. The clones closest to Fumotocho, who were part of the merchant network, had been ordered to send support as fast as possible. They were, however, hours away at quickest speed, and that was if they didn't miss the paths that the team had taken. Other clones were dispatched. Zuya informed the Hokage of what was happening as soon as she was free, and he ordered the network to find Jiraiya as soon as possible, and to order him straight to Fumotocho. He seemed to have an idea about who was the cause of this, and wanted the Toad Sage on the scene pronto. The clones, however, were one step ahead. Sayu was a former guard of the merchant network, and she'd been one of those dispatched to find the Sannin from the very moment they'd first been informed about Naruto's situation. There were 24 like her, all over the village, trying to find the older shinobi. Unsurprisingly, most were concentrated on the red light district, which was where Jiraiya could usually be found. Sayu had another target in mind. Last time she was out of the tunnels for ramen, she'd heard rumors of perverts spying on women relaxing in the hot springs. She hadn't given the matter much thought, but now that she was looking, she wouldn't be surprised to find that Jiraiya was the source of those rumors. And, as the man himself had said, a rumor always had bits of truth at its source. It wasn't like a single clone outside the brothels would make much difference anyway. Doing quick replacements, she efficiently canvassed the many hot springs close to the wall. Nothing, nope, nothing, a singular cat, nothing. What was that? Perched on the side of the wall, there was someone there. Sayu couldn't tell who it was, as the man, she supposed, had some form of camouflage coat hanging over his shoulders. She wouldn't have noticed him if not for the slight movement of a pen of some sort drawing her attention. One last switch brought her right beside the man. From this close, Jiraiya's white hair was evident, and he had a lecherous smile going from ear to ear. He was also mumbling something, but it was too low to be heard, a fact she was glad for. "Sensei, the Hokage is calling for you," she said clearly when it was evident he hadn't registered her presence. "Hiruzen knows I'm busy right now," their mentor in spycraft replied, not taking his eyes from the hole he was looking through. His fingers wrote out 3 more lines, and Sayu could swear he was about to start drooling. "Naruto's in danger," she continued. Jiraiya went instantly from his crouch to looking at her in the eyes as if he'd teleported. Gone was the perverse grin, and the man's glare was all business. "Clone." Sayu nodded. "Situation." Jiraiya didn't blink, staring her down intently. Naruto was taken down and captured in Fumotocho, the location of his C-ranked mission, she explained. He managed to free himself, but he's currently fighting some sort of bizarre patchwork beasts along with at least a poison specialist. It's in some form of underground base, probably close to the village. The Toad Senin scowled. Orochimaru. The next second, he clapped his hand on the ground, and the largest toad Sayu had ever seen appeared before him. He wasted no time jumping on the amphibian's back. Phew Mutocho, on the double. The toad's leap was prodigious, taking Jiraiya right to the wall, with a second carrying him out of sight. Sayu didn't know what to do for a second. She'd completed her mission, but things didn't feel right. An idea quickly came to mind, and she didn't waste a second before implementing it. A pair of kawarimi took her beyond the wall, and 5 more allowed her to catch up to their teacher. You coming with me? Jiraiya said, not moving from his position on his summons. How else are you going to get updates? Sayu replied, sticking herself to the amphibian's back. It wasn't something she'd practiced, so it would be good training at least. Real-time situation updates, right? Jiraiya said with a grin. I could live with that. You have a name? Sayu the clone replied as she sent an update to the network. Ha ha ha. The man laughed. That brings back memories. Well, Sayu, hang on tight. We've got at least an hour's road to Fumotocho, and Gamesaku here's a fast but bumpy ride. The wave of newly spawned clones, which was the largest to date, saw the 3 genin go down as they appeared. As such, they reacted instantly. Fan out. The clone who'd appeared closest to Naruto said. Those in the back, I need drainers and spheres. Front, we need to push forward and make some space. They couldn't play for time anymore. Woo-oo. The clones yelled in unison, charging forward. Arrow after arrow pelted those who had appeared on the walls and ceiling, but the number of bunshin thinned slowly. Those arrows that didn't break were gathered, if only to have extra weapons to use. What are you? The voice demanded, an undercurrent of fear now clear in his tone. Your end, the leader replied with a scowl. Another clone had a flash of inspiration. With some judicious use of a Kairaka Jigakuhai, he'd weakened the hinges on one of the doors enough that a couple of clones could rip it out. It was then given to a pair of bunshin on the ceiling, who accepted the impromptu shield gladly. Using said protection, the duo charged forward at speed, the few clones still above dropping to thin the beastly herd. Behind them, a horde followed, regardless of cover. Arrows still thinned their ranks, but they were now advancing fast toward their foe. That can't be. The man cried as he fired while stepping back. No genin can do something like that. Watch us, the pair of shielding clones replied, echoed by a number of those following. There was a last shot from the archer, then the man was heard running away at full speed, leaving the clones with only the beasts. With him gone, the chimeras were quickly eliminated, as the few who could reach the ceiling weren't enough to counter the few hundred bunshin left. The Naruto clone who'd taken command looked around as the last few humanoid beasts breathed their last. Everyone, teams of 6. Go on and scout, I want Ibisu and that archer found. Rip the doors out and use them as shields, no reason to get sniped. Hi, the many clones replied, acting as ordered. The group that already had a door ran forward, accompanied by 4 more bunshin, while the rest started gathering more shields. The leading clone moved to the group that had taken up the original trio's protection. That was the largest group at 10. 4 had hands on Naruto's back, replenishing their reserves in case of combat. While they could drain chakra from the air or the walls, It wasn't as fast or effective as draining people, Naruto especially. In a case like this, the extra time wasn't worth it. You 10 are staying with me and the team, we're getting out as soon as an exit is found, the leader said. We already have troops on the way, and it's better if we can point them directly to the base. Not to mention I want everyone who fell unconscious as far from here as we can get them. He didn't know why the poison hadn't worked on the new clones while taking down the originals, but now wasn't the time to think of such things. There would be plenty of time in the future to do so. He then sat down in the cell the group had chosen and waited behind an impromptu barricade. An exit would be found, they just had to wait until then. Shuken knew he should have gone back to the Konoha ninja in his lab, but he couldn't help but make sure his masterpiece was still in perfect condition. It was the crowning achievement of his scientific career. The body was solid enough to maintain the grudge near indefinitely, and it was built of the greatest parts he'd harvested over the years. The control system was more complex than any other suit he had in this place, but it was worth it for the results it gave. But, as usual, his time admiring his greatest work was once again cut short. Jiro ran in like the Shinigami's hounds were after his soul, and went straight for him. "Master," he cried out, clearly winded. Surprising, given the body he was in. "We have to escape." "Escape?" Shuken repeated, confused. "Why would we escape?" "The swarm." He continued. "The swarm is coming, and it won't stop." "The swarm?" the scientist asked, not making sense of what was said. "I send you against a trio of genin, the lowest actual ninja, and you come back yelling about a swarm." The blonde-haired man suddenly noticed a detail. Did you run out of arrows?" That was surprising. Jiro was a crack shot with a bow at any distance, and the suit he wore only made him deadlier. "Yes," Jiro finally answered, looking down. "I shot and shot and shot, but there were always more targets to remove. Every single one another of those orange boys, and they took down the beasts two at the time." "Shadow clones," Shuken replied. "That wasn't so dangerous, if Jiro was right, with those numbers they'd fall out of chakra exhaustion soon enough. Even with whatever was sealed on that boy." "Go back," the scientist said, handing the hunter a pair of quivers. "The clones are just a ploy, they'll disappear soon enough." "Are you crazy?" the servant replied. "They're infinite." Shuken sighed. There was no such thing as infinite chakra, everyone who used it knew that very well. But Jiro had never been a ninja, and had never had any form of chakra training, so superstitions like that did appear from time. "They aren't, I can promise you," the scientist explained. "Depending on that boy's reserves, they may even already have disappeared. Kichibunshin aren't made to be used in great numbers, especially not by genin." "Really?" Jiro asked, unsure. Shuken nodded. "Really?" The servant turned to the door, only to find the lock and handle reddening quickly. It burst open a second later, and 4 similar faces could be seen on the other side. "Found you!" they chorused in an eerie echo. The tunnels near the cells had widened into a full complex once the clones had escaped from the part they had been imprisoned in. With all the crisscrossing corridors they found, the teams split up in every direction, trying to find their targets. They still opened every door, not leaving a single room unsearched. And most of the times, they wished they hadn't done so. Judging by the number of rooms, this base had once been the home of a much larger contingent of people than the number they'd already faced. There were numerous labs, each equipped differently, clearly prepared for whatever gruesome experiments they were used in. And oftentimes, there were still results of those experiments to be found. There were limbs and claws hanging from hooks here and there as eyeless faces of both humans and animals stood in proud places upon various tables. There were human chests open for all to see, some with organs missing, some not. Everything was abnormally fresh, with no traces of decomposition or the like, something the many Narutos attributed to the seals that could be found everywhere. More than a single clone tried purging their non-existent lunches at the site, and those that did not could only feel an uncommonly strong rage surging from their core. This was even worse than Gato in Wave. This was plainly inhuman. The leader of the fifth group was one of those who raged, actions like this shouldn't fly, not in any self-respecting world. He and his group went from room to room, checking each face in turn. Ibisu hadn't been found yet, which was both a good thing and a bad one. Bad because he was still missing, and whoever had done this could be doing the same to him any minute. Good because they hadn't found anyone alive yet. If Ibisu had been found, it would have been in any state the clones would care to see their sensei in. The groups were receiving regular updates as the various teams finished their assigned corridors. By the time the fifth group was halfway done with their own path, they finally received one of the updates they were looking for. Sensei found it said. Along that was the last sight of the sending Bunshin, that of Ibisu stripped to his boxers lying tied up and unconscious on an operating table. The thumbs up of the clone beside him was especially helpful in that regard. Ibisu was barely breathing, and without that part of the vision there might have been doubts. That news brought the morale of the team back up, and they rushed through the next rooms. Since Sensei had been found, there was no need to check every face that stood frozen. If it wasn't an enemy or an exit, there was no reason to dally. 8 rooms later, the clone at point stopped the whole group. "Shush!" he whispered, and everyone stopped. With all the beasts dead and the clones being as widespread as they were, the place should be completely silent. But not here, as voices could be heard coming from farther down the corridor. The sounds were much too low for words to be made out, but it was still the first indication of their foes since that archer escaped. The 6 clones didn't hesitate, skipping forward as silently as possible. The room the voices came from was quickly found, and it was a big one, judging by the closest doors on the same side. With only hand signs, the leader quickly ordered everyone around. A single black sphere was brought up to meld the lock open, while a clone at the back updated everyone. The 2 shield bearers stood doors at the ready, prepared for any incoming attack. This door was no more resistant than any before, and the metal melted in second. A good kick later, and they were in. "Found you!" all 4 clones at the door said in chorus as only Bunshin could. The archer reacted instantly, loosing a single shot directly at the clones. It hit only metal, as the blockers had been ready for such a thing. Now that they were in an area with more light, the archer could clearly be seen. He was a tall man with the usual scars ninjas acquired during their lives, with short cropped hair and a solid build. Like all the beasts, though, he had changes all over. His eyes were more animal-like than human, and there was an extra pair of feline ears laying atop his head in addition to his human ones. But most evident was the extra arm at his back. The man was clearly practiced with it, as he used it to reload his bow at a rate that was phenomenal. Behind him was a blonde man in a lab coat, who the clones supposed was his boss. The rage rose again at the sight. This was the horrible person who'd done such things. Behind him were more examples of his inhumanity. Even though the bodies there were clearly in a better state, the stitches could easily be seen from their position. The light and the size of the room had another advantage, which the clones used quickly. After quick Kawarimi, they were spread all over the room, no longer at the mercy of the archer. 2 of the Bunshin attacked him, while the 4 other went directly to the person they saw as the mastermind. The archer managed a last kill before being taken down with a Saishuden, while the scientist released a short-ranged wave of lightning that only a single clone dodged. Irritating, the man said, only for another clone team to enter the room. Behind them, more could be heard, all rushing toward combat. This didn't have the expected reaction from the man, who smiled. Well, he said. It seems it's time for some actual battle testing, then. He did 4 hand seals, and slammed the palm of his hand to his forehead. Iron Shinton Bunshin no Jutsu, he yelled as he did so, his body falling to the ground. And deeper in the room, everything rumbled as a giant rose from his resting place, a bizarre echoing laughter ringing all over the place. Prank Day 176. The last remaining member of the 5th clone group didn't know what to do. He could hear chains clanking to the ground and could see the distant form of something rising under a tarp at the far end of the room, but didn't know how to react. He had no clue what jutsu the man had just performed. Should he go and secure the man's body? Was it a decoy? Beside him, the newly arrived group of Kichibunshin took position, a pair even readying black spheres. Sorry to keep you waiting. Shuken's voice rang out, the laughter somehow continuing in tandem with his words. The giant form took a step forward, causing the cloth covering to fall to the ground behind it. He could tell with a glance that this monster, not the patchwork beasts from before, was the goal of whatever horrible research was going on here. It stood just inches shorter than the ceiling, was thicker than the oldest trees, and was crisscrossed with the black sticks the clones had come to associate with the chimeras in this place. Like the chimeras, he had more limbs than was natural, 2 extra pair of mismatched arms jutted from the sides of the thing's chest, while a heavy tail like that of a lizard trailed behind him. There were eyes everywhere, from its stomach to its elbows, and its feet ended in things more akin to talons than to regular toes. Worse, however, was its head. It was like someone had tried smashing 5 different faces together, then had said close enough before giving up. It had more noses than mouths, and it had several of those, and he suspected the scattering of mismatched eyes stretched all the way around to the back of his head. Its cranium was abnormally large, as if it had more than one brain, and various animal ears twitched in every direction from the top of its scalp. The laughter stopped. So, like what you see? The many mouths exclaimed in a bizarre echo. The clones were too shocked to answer. This was the biggest thing they'd ever fought, save the giant serpents during the invasion, and those had required special measures that weren't currently available. With the armor-like plates that were clearly visible and the chains swinging from the biggest arms, it was a clear contender for the title of physically strongest foe that the many Narutos had ever faced. Most skilled wasn't a question, Orochimaru. Well? The monster asked. We've waited long enough. At those words, it barged toward them with ground-eating strides. Everyone reacted instantly. Those with spheres threw them forward while the rest responded with the first jutsu that came to mind. The beast ignored the blinding flashes, and a wave of its chains took out the few clones who'd countercharged, intent on electrocuting the thing. The member of the 5th group, however, did a quick kawarimi backwards out of the room. It wasn't that he was retreating, no. It was just that the creature's bulk was larger than the door, which meant his new position would give him the advantage. His thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of hands clapping together. That was when the entire room's floor turned into jutting spikes, instantly dispelling all the other clones. Oh, it could use jutsu too. Thinking quickly, the last bunshin arrived at a decision. "Hey, you muscle-bound brute," it yelled, grabbing the thing's attention. "You can't catch me!" it screamed, adding an obscene gesture to the mix. He then ran off in the opposite direction from which he'd originally come. He hadn't made much distance before the beast burst through the too small door as if it weren't there. Luckily, the corridors were smaller than the room had been, which should slow him down some. "Doton, Daumen Toppa!" it yelled, slamming its hands on the walls. Or not, the bunshin thought as the corridor doubled in size. He didn't stop, yelling insults and the like as he continued running. He gained some more breathing room as the thing turned to send a bolt of lightning to intercept clones coming from the other way, but lost more as the creature quickly caught up. With his stride, he covered ground nearly twice as fast, and quick replacements weren't useful in the dark and twisting corridors. His play for time was rewarded a few minutes later when a quick memory message arrived. An exit had been found. Better yet, it was on the opposite side of the complex. A confirmation came the next second from the team defending the real Naruto, along with new orders for the clone groups. Orders that he very much agreed with. Trusting the others to do their jobs, he turned left at the next junction, preparing a quick sphere. The bunshin fired it as soon as the monster came into sight, then resumed running without looking at the results. Behind him, the sound of the beast's chakra-reinforced chains intercepting the incoming projectile was followed by the sphere's premature detonation. A quick jutsu widened the corridor, and the chase was back on. That was how things went for the next few minutes. The clone kept the thing's attention with insults and quick techniques, all the while ignoring the man's words. He made sure not to provide too obvious of a target after a lightning bolt nearly took off his head, but outside of that he kept to his role. Which meant that, once he got the message he'd been waiting for, he circled back to a very specific location. He ignored the man's taunts as he did so. He knew that he was running out of chakra, but he had more than enough to last until his role was done. He ran straight through the next junction, looking back only at the last instant. Which meant he didn't miss the look on the face of his foe as dozens of clones fired streams of flame at him from every direction. He didn't get the look he'd expected. No eyes widening in surprise, no scowls, no fervent denials. Just him coming to a stop in an instant, while a pair of hands, the middle ones this time, he noticed, quickly formed seals. "Doton, Hirado," he announced simply. The clone then knew no more. The Kichibunshin leading the group defending the real Naruto, along with the other two genin, winced as the memories of multiple dying clones hit him. Their last moments weren't very revealing, only informing the bunshin that it was a Doton technique that had ended them. Turning around, once he opened his eyes, was much more informative. On the east side of the village, there was a crater-like depression, easily 25 meters wide. The main part of it was in the street, but a good chunk of a nearby field had also been destroyed, and there was now a building which was missing a wall and, as such, was in danger of crumbling. The hope that their foe had died in the ambush regardless of its last move were dashed when the beast burst from the center of the crater. It wasn't unharmed, having some burns here and there, but it was still clearly mobile and able to fight. He didn't wait a moment before sending out new orders, as everyone still alive below was needed up here, pronto. The numbers of bunshin that responded as the monstrous creature climbed out of the crater it was in didn't reassure the leading clone one bit. They were left with fewer than 100 clones. While the ones defending Naruto had charged up as much as they could while waiting for an exit, that still didn't leave them with much to work with. Now what? One of the clones who'd just arrived asked. The leader didn't have a ready answer. Crawling out of the broken remains of the corridor he'd been in, Shuken shook his head and got his bearings. He'd been having so much fun testing the limits of his creation that he'd lost track of time. The ambush had been an unpleasant wake-up call. He'd been injured somewhat before taking the clones down, but nothing serious. Eyes and skin were easily replaced, and the grudge compensated for the rest. He had to admit, this was the longest he'd worked this body, and it responded as well as he'd expected, if not better. He was glad to see his masterpiece deserved the name. Anyway, he'd played long enough, time to take down whatever foes were left. Taking a deep breath with his 2 pairs of lungs, Shuken focused on sensing his adversaries. The difference between his original body and this one made the exercise somewhat difficult, but after a few moments he had a fair enough feel for the surrounding chakra. And better yet, he could still detect his tracking seals. While he'd not taken the time to install said seals on the prisoners, those made it easy to ignore the various tagged villagers to focus on the real targets. He wasn't surprised to find a number of them crowded together inside the inn, one of the most available exits let into its basement. A quick shunshin brought him right to the door, where he spat out a bolt of lighting at the biggest grouping of chakra signatures. He took down at least 3, while the rest spread out in a burst of chakra he associated with the replacement technique. He followed that with another flat earth jutsu, leveling the building and bursting the numerous clones still in the corridors below. There hadn't been anything other than storage rooms close to this exit, so nothing of importance was lost. Jumping clear of the falling building, Shuken tracked his remaining targets. 17 left, he noted, no 18, he then amended as another clone popped into existence. The scientist didn't hesitate, charging the summoner. Whoever this ninja was, his reserves had to be giving out. They were running out of clones. The clone who'd taken charge of things had been lucky enough to evade the first bolt of lightning, and he'd taken position on top of the mayor's house, after a pair of quick kawarimi, to keep himself aware of the flow of battle. They were losing. Worse was how clear it was. By now, the clones fought in ones and twos, trying to buy time. Below, a pair of clones had the beast in a pincer, looking for an opening where they could use their spheres to full effect. So far, said opening wasn't forthcoming. They'd tried just about everything. Their blinding technique wasn't affecting it, and the creature wasn't leaving them time to set up a tornado. Getting close enough to shock it was basically impossible, as it didn't have any blind spot they could take advantage of, and the thing had the blatant Hellfire's measure, dodging it without fail. Their last main technique, their water jutsu, was just an invitation for a lightning bolt, as they'd found out the hard way. It even had some form of close-ranged electric surge, which meant that grabbing on and draining it wasn't an option. Disarming it of those chains had first seemed a possibility, but they'd learned that the things were more solid than expected. They resisted high heat and didn't channel lightning, which meant another avenue of attack was cut off. Frankly, the best they could do was buy time. That, and flee, but Ibisu was still trapped below, along with a few clones, and they weren't going to abandon their teacher to his fate. He knew they had reinforcements incoming, if not what they were, but he was afraid they wouldn't make much of a difference. He made a sudden realization as 2 clones below fell to the creature's Earth Spikes jutsu. The Naruto clones only had 2 ways of taking down enemies. One was quick takedowns with forbidden techniques, which had been the staple of individual ninja during the invasion, and the second was outlasting whoever they were battling, like they did against Gaara. Unfortunately, this beast seemed like it would be the one outlasting them, this time. A quick replacement saved him from a bolt of lightning, depositing him on the other side of the road, while another clone tried to use the opening to slam a flaming sphere right in the creature's leg. He wasn't fast enough, though, as the opponent managed a quick shunshin to emerge unscathed. That's all you can do. The same techniques over and over. The thing yelled in his bizarre echoing voice. Pathetic. Also insulting was the fact that the thing had started on a critique of their combat style, analyzing each and every technique that came its way and pointing out their flaws. Most of them were already well known by the clones, which only made it more grating. 7 left, it pointed out. With 3 of those unconscious, which probably means that they are the real ones. Shit. Time to end this. He then started chaining lightning bolts one after the other, targeting them with unerring precision. His 3 pairs of arms somehow allowed him to use 3 copies of the same technique at once. All the clones started replacing themselves repeatedly, hoping to delay the inevitable. One lasted 2 jumps before getting hit, while another vanished out of chakra depletion after the 5th. The 2 left looked at each other from opposite sides of the street, sharing a meaningful glance, then shifted to the road proper. If they were going to be falling, better to go out fighting. A ninja to the last, it said, and Naruto could find a note of contempt in its voice. How unsurprising. The one formerly leading prepared for a charge, hoping to land at least a final attack, when a message arrived. Incoming. He nearly mistimed his jump and fell prey to the field of spikes because of that. His compatriot wasn't as lucky, being burst on the spot. Which was when a giant toad fell straight on the thing. It was at least 4 times as big as the beast, and squashed it to the ground instantly. It didn't manage to kill it, though. No. It yelled. I won't be defeated so easily. Glowing from visibly chakra-reinforced strength, he started pushing himself to freedom. Rasengan. The toad sage disappeared from the summoned's back, only to reappear right above the man. In his hand was a glowing sphere of chakra, making a whirring noise like dozens of buzzsaws acting in unison. Before the beast could do anything, Jiraiya smashed the ball straight into his chin, pushing through without any resistance. The monster's head was blown to pieces instantly, and it fell back under the giant toad's mass. The last Kichibunshin fell to the ground in a heap. After the long battle they'd gone through, such an end felt pretty anticlimactic, but he was glad for Jiraiya's presence. This was the closest the clones had been to actually dying off, and that would have been the best scenario. With what they'd found, the man might have kept the real Naruto alive for his experiments, but he was sure he wouldn't have made the same mistake twice. You okay? Jiraiya asked as he stepped forward. What was clearly a female Naruto clone was right behind him, appearing with a kawarimi. Give me enough time to drain some chakra, and I'll be fine, the Bunshin replied, rising. Clone then, the Sannin noted. The original. Give me a second and I'll lead you to him, he said, flashing his hands in the seals necessary for chakra drain. He maybe had one replacement left in him before he burst, and this wasn't the time to take risks. Naruto came back to consciousness for the second time that day, and was happy to see that he wasn't chained up or imprisoned this time. Inside his head, however, he had images fighting each other for supremacy, and he wasn't able to make heads or tails of whatever had gone on. As such, he shook his head and rose. Being that he didn't seem to be captive, he'd be able to get answers quickly enough. His rising quickly drew attention, and he found himself with the rest of his team save Ibisu. 2 clones were also present, along with, for some reason, his spying teacher Jiraiya. He focused on the last. I'm surprised to see you here. You think I'd let one of my students fall against some Orochimaru wannabe? He replied with a smile. I was on my way as soon as I heard. He then continued in a more serious vein. And thank God for him. The only Naruto clone dressed in his normal orange jumpsuit added. Without him, we'd probably have been done for. Naruto scowled. How bad? He quickly looked to the side at his other clones. They seemed perfectly fine, but they might have slept through the battle like he had. There was however one conspicuous absence that gave Naruto shivers. Did something happen to Abisu? The Naruto clone shook his head. He's fine. His pride will probably be the worst hit. Where is he, then? He's still out, Jiraiya replied. And he should be back up in a few hours. I could probably wake him up, but I'm not a medic nin. Better he regain consciousness normally than what I'd do. Good, Naruto replied with a smile. I suppose you're like us and want an update, correct? Iruka asked, caressing the still sleeping Ishibo. I'm not the only one with scrambled memories, I suppose, Naruto said. Both Myoru and Iruka nodded enthusiastically at that. The group sat down as Naruto's Kichibunshin went through his tale. Judging by Jiraiya's reactions, he had already gone through this once. He nodded in all the right places and asked for further clarifications on various points. As the story advanced, Naruto scowled more and more. It was clear that, without Jiraiya's timely arrival, they would have been done for. You were lucky. From what I can tell, the man wasn't really a ninja, Jiraiya said as the tale was in its last parts. If he'd had the relevant experience along with that powerful body and his elemental ninjutsu, he'd have been an S-ranked fighter quite probably. Yeah, Naruto replied a few moments after the clone finished. Still, that doesn't feel like a victory, even if we're the last ones standing. Everyone nodded at that. There'll be battles like that through your entire career, Jiraiya added, nodding wisely. I should know, I went through my share of them. In fact, I owe the title of Sanin to a battle that, even now, years after the fact, still feels like a loss. You mean the one against Hanzo the Salamander? Myoru asked. Yes, the Toad Sage confirmed. Orochimaru, Tsunade and I survived, and that's the best we can say about that fight. The fact that the title we received spread far and wide after the battle only added salt to the wound. He scowled at the reminder. Still, you're all still alive, and your enemies are defeated. Maybe the results aren't what you'd hoped for, but take your victories where you can get them. As long as you live and learn, that's the important part of it. Naruto nodded, as did every clone. They all had things that needed improvement fast, and various ideas on how to do so. How about? Naruto started. Jiraiya stopped him with a raised hand. There'll be more than enough time to discuss this later, and that's the kind of job that's tailor-made for that council of yours. Think about it, and we'll discuss it back home. There are more important things right now. Like what? Naruto asked. You're up for making shadow clones. The Sanin countered, rising. How many do you need? Naruto replied as he followed suit. As many as you can give me, the man said, pointing toward the village. I'll use Earth Jutsu to open up the sealed entrances, but I'll need hands to empty the place. That stuff needs to move pronto, especially if Orochimaru has anything interesting here, and somehow got a warning. Even the... Naruto gulped as an image flashed in his mind. The bodies. I might take a few of the more complete ones back to Konoha for studying by specialists, but outside of that, no, the Toad Senin replied. I'll build a pyre some distance from the village, and we'll burn whatever's left. I don't want anything that could be found by any sort of scavengers. Right. Naruto nodded, followed by his clones. A moment later, the clearing they were in was filled with copies of the orange-wearing blonde. So, where do we start? He asked. This time, Ibisu was happy to note, there was no scratching of quills or scathing comments as he came to. He was also untied, still clad only in his boxers, and in what seemed like a bed. He might have thought the previous time a dream if not for the few incisions this Shuken had done that were still hurting him. Still, there was no reason to play possum. The first thing he noted was that this wasn't his in-room. The second was the slowing descending sun he could see outside the window. The third was the fact that Jiraiya of the Sannin was standing at his bedside while writing something down in a book. Jiraiya-sama! He exclaimed, shooting upwards. He then realized that bowing from a lying position was basically impossible, and couldn't figure out what to do. At ease, at ease. The Sennin replied, closing his book. How are you feeling? Ibisu twisted around some as a test, and found nothing wrong outside the few cuts. Nothing that would prevent me from doing my duty. Good, the sage said, turning his chair toward the bed. I'd like your report on what happened in the village. The special Jonin shrank a little. Could I be informed of the status of my students? He asked. Jiraiya simply smiled. They're all fine. They actually did very good for their rank, managing to escape the place by themselves. If it hadn't been for the trouble they'd stirred, I might not have found this place at all. That was the story the group had agreed would be the public version of what had happened. Those in the know would get the full report, but Naruto hadn't seen any reason to reveal everything to his sensei. He didn't doubt the man would treat him properly anymore, but he liked the different ways Ibisu interacted with every one of his clones. Thank the kami, Ibisu said, lowering his head. After a moment of silence, he looked straight at the Sannin and nodded. Where should I start? When you arrived in Fumotocho would be the best. Ibisu then went over everything. It was a little shameful to admit how easily he'd been taken down to anyone, but Jiraiya was a superior, and he would have to go through this anyway with the Hokage later. Jiraiya was silent as the special Jonin went over every word the man who'd captured him had said, and kept so minutes after the discussion had ended, clearly deep in thought. Could I ask something, Jiraiya-sama? Ibisu finally said, breaking the silence. That broke the Sannin out of his thoughts. Go ahead. Am I unworthy as a teacher? The Toad Sage's eyes widened in surprise. What brought that on? I'm only a special Jonin, and I've never even been invited to the Jonin trials, Ibisu replied. I'm still behind the rest of my teammates in basically every domain, while they're higher ranked than me. His face fell deeper. The day I met Naruto, he beat my shadow clone easily, and I'm pretty sure he was holding back. And now, someone who isn't even a ninja got the best of me. He took a deep breath, choking back a sob. Should I just give up and give my team to someone else? Jiraiya smirked sadly. I know that feeling so well, you haven't a clue. What? Ibisu replied, shocked. How do you think it was, being in a team with Tsunade and Orochimaru? The Sannin replied. The last Senju, and a born genius. But, you're Jiraiya of the Sannin. I wasn't always that, he pointed out. And even then, I still failed. Tell me, who were my students? The Yondaime, of course, the special Jonin replied. And who were the two other members of that genin team? Ibisu started, opened his mouth, then closed it without saying a word. Thought as much. Jiraiya nodded sadly. They never amounted to much. One died during his second Chunin exam, while the other was a genin all his life until the Kyuubi claimed him. And Minato was a genius like I've never seen. Even to this day I wonder if he didn't end up so skilled in spite of me. He raised his eyes, looking toward the ceiling. I said the same to my own teacher Hiruzen, and he told what I'll now tell you. Jiraiya went silent for a moment, for emphasis. Ask your students. But they. Ibisu started, only to be interrupted. They know better than you think, the Sannin said. Sometimes, there are things that can only be seen from the outside. And they may be young, but they notice more than you realize. He rose. I'll leave you to your thoughts. Anyway, I have more than enough paperwork to go through. He then walked out. Ibisu stood there in his bed for a few minutes, before rising himself. It couldn't hurt to hear his team's opinion, and it was their team as well as his. They should be allowed their say at the very least. It didn't take much time for Ibisu to find his way down in the tunnels under the city, and the many Narutos there going back and forth were always happy to give him directions. He found his three genin in the largest room he'd seen, huddled around a blond man on the ground. Said man was still breathing, but seemed unconscious somehow. They also hadn't noticed his arrival. Good evening, students. Sensei. The three exclaimed as they turned. Glad to see you're all right, Myoumru added, to which everyone else, including the rabbit on Aruko's head, nodded. I feel the same way, the man replied, then took a deep breath. No reason to wait. He then bowed. You three have my most sincere excuses for the deplorable consequences of my weakness, he said clearly, not looking up. I feel that I failed all of you today, and allowed you to be captured due to my own negligence. Wait, Sensei, Naruto replied, raising both hands up. We didn't do any better. Ishibo here probably has a better nose than the four of us combined, and even he detected the poison too late. Ibisu shook his head. That may be, but I am still your Jonin sensei. It is on my shoulder that your protection lies, and I've failed in that mission shamefully. He took another breath. Should you request it, I will ensure this team finds a better sensei to fill my post. You three have a great future ahead of you, and I would not want to be the one holding you back. He then fell silent, and waited for his judgment. Nope. Naruto was the first to reply. Nope. There's no giving up, not in this team. Myoumru continued. Why would we want to get rid of you? You could find much better teachers. A taijutsu specialist would be of much more help in developing Myoumru's family style, while both kenjutsu and ninjutsu masters would be glad to have you, Naruto, as a student. And I know an Inuzuka Jonin who I'm sure would be interested on how their jutsu could work with Ishibo here. We'd much prefer if you stayed, Sensei Aruko said, and Ishibo nodded at that. And we're more than happy with the things you're teaching us. Like the illusions you started me on. The female clone didn't have them down, yet, but it was only a matter of time. Or the sensing exercises, Myoumru added. I already have a ninjutsu teacher, and a kenjutsu teacher, and even a trapping teacher, which I have to thank you for, he said with a nod. I'd prefer a sensei I can trust with what I want to do with my life. Yeah. Myoumru added. And anyway, if you think you're not strong enough, Just train until you're satisfied with yourself. Naruto exclaimed. What about your own training? The teacher replied. How will I be in charge of it if I'm away practicing? A shadow clone is more than enough for teaching, most of the time, Sensei Naruto pointed out. I wouldn't mind, Iruka added, to which Myoru nodded. Ebisu was silent for a moment. Are you certain of your decision? All the genin nodded. Then the matter is closed, he said with finality. I'll leave you to your work. He glanced back down. Who is that, anyway? The one in charge is of this place, Naruto replied. He used a bizarre technique to take control of one of the spare bodies laying around. He indicating the surroundings with a wave of his hand, where some of the spare bodies were still present. And fell to the ground like this. We're not sure what to do with him, since he's still alive. I see, the sensei replied. Well, there are mind specialists in Konoha, which may be able to extract some valuable information. Having him transported might very well be worth it. Okay, Naruto replied, going to the walls to find something to bind the captive. Ebisu simply made his way out of the room as he did so. Then he smiled. He'd been afraid for nothing. Walking back toward the exit, he found himself accosted by a trio of clones carrying the most bizarre beast. A second followed a little later, with more still coming. Curious, he went to the source, and found piles of deceased chimeras like those he'd already seen. Now, he wasn't specialized in autopsies, but he knew enough to tell that the many monsters here had been electrocuted to death. All of them, it seemed. That was bizarre, since the only lightning user he'd heard about was these beasts' master. Jiraiya wasn't one, and the one member of his team who knew any elemental jutsu was Naruto with his fire technique. In fact, looking around, he could see the results of the boy's technique. The melted hinges were especially illuminating in that regard, especially since the room on the other side was clearly a cell. Which meant his team had been right in this place. Something was wrong here. The special Jonin took a deeper look, and quickly found something else. Remains of broken arrows could be found all over, as if someone had been shooting at the people here. Taking that all together meant something even more fishy. His team was hiding something from him. Prank Day 177. Another batch of scrolls, Ero-Senin, Naruto said, coming out of the former laboratory. Beside him, Myoru and Iruka unloaded their own burdens, adding to Naruto's pile. I told you not to call me that. The man replied, taking the top document and quickly going over it. One of Jiraiya's shadow clones sitting beside the man did the same with a second scroll. Why can't you call me sensei, like most students do? Well, the name fits, Myoru pointed out. You can't deny that, Mr. Super Pervert. And we already have a sensei, in case you didn't notice, Iruka continued, indicating Ebisu with a wave of her hand. The special Jonin was in charge of the pyre, and by the scowl on his face, he didn't like the job any more than the many Narutos would have. Jiraiya tossed the rolled up scroll onto one of the piles behind him. Yeah. And how is it going downstairs? We're more than halfway done, Naruto replied. Unless there's another archive down there, we should be finished before the end of the day. That was the reason why they were still in Fumotocho. Jiraiya was adamant that the place had to be emptied before they all left, and everyone agreed with him. But Shuken had been a scientist, which meant reams of documents and notes about both the running of this place and the experiments that had been performed therein. Going through that was a long process, especially since Jiraiya, or one of his clones, had to go through every document first. As the highest-ranked Konoha ninja in Fumutocho, it was his decision if scrolls had to be sealed from view, so he had to check them all. From there they went into multiple piles, where Naruto clones stacked, ordered and indexed them. They even sometimes copied them, as the Toad Sennin had given them leave to copy whatever jutsu scrolls weren't sealed by his order. The Iruka library would be growing quite a bit once they were back in Konoha. The three genin were on their way back down when Jiraiya exclaimed. Finally. Yes? Iruka asked, turning around. The Sannin held up the scroll in his hands. I was waiting for this one. It has the technical specifications for the combined tracking /control seal that was used on the villagers in this place. Said villagers were still under the seal, hiding from the ninjas. They hadn't said a word yet, and Naruto suspected that was part of their restrictions. It even has instructions on how to perform the counter seal, which'll save me from having to build one. He looked at the three genin. Any of you have experience in seals? Naruto stepped forward after a moment. Takuno has started me on building explosive and smoke tags, he offered. The other two shook their heads, confident that Jiraiya would understand the meaning. Okay, well, you have to start somewhere. Come here, Naruto, the Sennin said, indicating a spot beside him as he withdrew his sealing equipment. The blonde genin did so. Now. Jiraiya started, taking the tone Naruto associated with the Sannin teaching. Counter seals are seal made to affect other seals. It's one of the most complex branches of Fuinjutsu, as seals often contain elements that would react to tampering. He pointed down at the scroll before him. That one was clearly made for easy removal, which means that it has very little that stops one from taking it off. Now, the main part of a counter seal is this one, which has to target the active part of the Fuinjutsu one is trying to remove. This is the capital part because Prank Day 179. So, anything urgent to report? The merchant clone in charge, seated at the end of the table, asked. Silence was his answer. Good. Meeting 63, then. First up is the trading network itself. How are things going? We're up by 17 contacts since last meeting, mostly in sand and water countries. A Bunshin on the left replied, his nose in a book. Added to that are a few dozens possible suppliers, especially in fish products. We also have our first contact with a purveyor of Suna steel. Good. No issue there. The clone shook his head in answer, as did his three assistants. Perfect then. Point 2, trade in Konoha. What's happening there? We're losing customers in Konoha, the Leaf Village representative said. Everyone turned toward him in a flash. Come again. Over the last week, 3 different shops cancelled their standing orders with us, and that without any stated reason, Jinii explained. I tried going to see the shop owners in question myself, but was given excuses or faced with a closed door. Did Ishiraku? One started. No, Jinii answered near instantly. In fact, our orders from Tki and the other restaurateurs having only gotten larger, as did those from Jiraiya's contacts. It's the latest customers suggested by Tki that went and cancelled their orders. There was silence for a moment. Did you talk to the man himself? The clone in charge finally asked. Not yet. Jinii replied, and Anii beside his shook her head negatively. The one time I went to Ishiraku, the man was absent, and I focused more on the shopkeepers themselves rather than the man who'd suggested them. Do that, the leader said, and nods all around the table echoed his decision. How about outside Konoha? There, Trade is slowly picking up, at least in most places, a shadow clone from the other side of the table replied. The merchants in Jincho certainly aren't, but Suna is quickly becoming our biggest secondary market, the man added with a smile. Right next to him, the pair of clones in charge of grass scowled. Naruto clones were competitive, if nothing else. It's at least that, the leader pointed out. Now, last point, and the most important. What's happening with our saboteurs? There were scowls all around. Difficult to say, the clone opposite the leader replied. We lost 3 suppliers since last meeting. One we're pretty sure is enemy action, since the man's fishing boats burned to the ground, but the other 2 were less certain. The first saying it's a bad harvest, which may be due to the wet climate in the last few weeks in that region, and the other may simply be a late shipment. There were nods all around. And our defensive measures? They're slowly advancing, the Bunshin finally replied. Our quick reaction teams are ready, but getting clones close to our various suppliers is a work in progress. Most of those places aren't hiring, and that makes having inconspicuous watchers around 24/7 somewhat difficult. We do have a few places covered, at least, and we'll keep working on it. Do that, the copy in charge confirmed. Any other business that needs to be gone over? Silence answered him again. Meeting adjourned, then. Next one is next week at location 17. Let's go, people. Prank day 182. We looted all the documents we could find, along with all the jutsu information there was. They're in the second and third scroll. The Sanin indicated those with his hands. The fourth contains a few examples of Shuken's work, in case Konoha's medics wanted to go over them. The last in the body of Shuken himself. You may want to have Inoichi go over it. There may be more information about Orochimaru's plans and methods in the man's brain. We left the building intact behind, as taking it down would remove the town from the map. Sending a team specialized in fortifications or demolitions in that direction would be a good idea, from my guess. Ibisu did not react outwardly at the incomplete report being given, but he was thinking furiously inside. What was being hidden? Based on his previous findings, he guessed that either his team was hiding part of their skills, or that there was another person involved in his team's escape. He'd thought about it along the way home, and those 2 options were the ones that made the most sense. Especially considering that Naruto was the Kyuubi's prison, and as such could be the target of enemy actions and kidnapping attempts. But which of the 2 was it? Whichever it was, it didn't reflect well on him. If one of his students was a plant, he'd gone on teaching a false genin for weeks without realizing it. While Konoha had some quite decent infiltrators, the idea that he might not have noticed such a thing hurt his pride as a teacher. If that was the truth, then he would never live down the shame. The fact that Naruto would have a guardian angel would hurt his pride less, but would still sting. He knew he wasn't the greatest of shinobi, but the idea that he'd been under watch at all times without a single inkling, that ate him inside a bit. What could he do about it? Good work, the Hokage said as he put down the scroll in his hand. The special Jonin pushed back the thoughts he'd been having, and focused on the present. You'll all be credited your C-rank mission, along with an extra A-rank mission for the takedown of one of Orochimaru's bases. Everyone smiled at that. I'm also ordering 2 days off your regular team training for recovery. You've been 2 weeks on mission, you deserve a few days of rest to compensate. Yes. Naruto exclaimed. Beside him, both of his other students smiled. Now, dismissed, the Sundame said with a nod. Jiraiya, stay behind. I have some more questions for you. Ibisu bowed, as did his students, and the four of them made their way out of the tower in silence. The special Jonin then directed them to a cafe close to the tower, and sat them down at a booth. I'll be quick, since I suspect everyone is anxious to get back to their own homes, he said once everyone was seated. Good work, team. The mission might not have gone as expected, but you all reacted professionally to the changes, and came through as needed. While I'll be waiting some time before asking for a second C rank, I have no complaints with your work outside the village, and I know you'll do Konoha proud in your following missions as well. He pushed back the fact that there was a secret between them to the back of his mind. Based on what he'd guessed, they might have been ordered to silence, and pushing for more information might even be treasonous in this case. Make sure to keep in shape, and we'll see each other on Friday. He bowed his head as a salute, and waved. Dismissed. His students made their goodbyes, each going in their own direction. Ibisu himself took the time to drink a good coffee, and pondered what to do. Between his abysmal performance against Shuken, and the fact that there might be a plant on or near his team, it was clear his skills were deficient. He'd not noticed before, because he'd coasted on his talents as a teacher and, while they hadn't atrophied, his skills as a ninja certainly hadn't improved much in the last few years. He'd been content that way once, but no longer. He needed to play catch up. The worst thing was, he had a good idea how to accomplish such a thing. It would hurt, both physically and mentally, but it was the best way to go at it. The Hokage hadn't prohibited training, only doing so as a team, and soonest started, soonest done. As such, he drained the last of his coffee in a single swig, and stepped outside into the evening air. While it was late for most people's training, he knew from experience where he could find the person he needed at this hour. He went straight for the wall and climbed up, then waited. He didn't have to do so for long. Before the minute was done, a pair of silhouettes appeared in the distance. At the speed they were going, it was but a moment before they passed Ibisu, and he forced himself to follow them. Yosh, teammate, Guy said as Ibisu fell into step beside him. Are you here to see the youth of Konoha flourish in the dusk of the day? He asked. The man clearly hadn't changed a bit. Not exactly, the special Jonin replied, forcing himself to maintain the pace. I was hoping to talk to you instead. Guy nodded seriously. Lee, double pace, he yelled, and his student instantly increased his rhythm. Guy instead slowed down, stopping a little later near one of the newly repaired parts of the wall. Now, what can I do for you, Ibisu? Said Ninja took a deep breath to center himself before speaking. I need to get stronger. Guy simply smiled and nodded. Let's get to it, then. Okay, that's done, Naruto said as the merchant network representative sat back down. Then, let's get to the meat of this meeting. Gigi, I suppose Jiraiya updated you with the full story. He did. Everyone else not clear on the happenings in Fumotocho. He continued. Everyone shook their heads, having been included in the latest mass update. Naruto had informed Iruka straight after leaving the rest of his team, even before said update was done. So, it's clear, it was sheer luck that Jiraiya arrived on time to save our backsides that day. Naruto inclined his head toward the Sannin. Thanks again for that one. My pleasure. One thing that battle made clear is that we have a long way to go if we want to be really effective as a ninja. I've been thinking about it for a good while, and I know I'm not the only one. So, ideas, people. Relying on luck isn't something we want to be known for. Nico was the first to raise his hand. We need some form of protocol for a situation like this one. What? That wasn't what Naruto had been expecting. This is the second time we learned about a battle happening from clones dying in combat, the spying advisor continued. While it couldn't be helped during the invasion, a simple message to the rest of us last time would have gained us nearly an hour in response time, which is enormous. The three adult ninja around that table nodded at that. Not only that, Kyuha added as he rose. But we also need a specific code for emergencies like this. The Hokage was in a meeting, and we could have lost time for nothing if we hadn't suspected what he'd answer. A quick way to contact Jiraiya in case of emergencies wouldn't be amiss, either. At this, said Sunin lowered his head at the memory. He clearly remembered what he'd been doing when Sao found him. Naruto was silent for a moment, then nodded. Good point. Nico, I'm putting you in charge of this. Meet with the others, and write out a communication protocol for emergencies. Next. Myungru was the one who rose this time. We need to master more techniques seamlessly. We would have been completely screwed if we'd had our hands paralyzed. Everyone nodded to that. We need better defensive techniques for clones. The chakra shield doesn't cut it. We have to get a way to immobilize opponents, especially fast ones. We need something to take down people who can tank most attacks. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Naruto exclaimed, trying calm people down. One at the time. Myungru, since sealless techniques are something you can train on outside this place, I'm putting you in charge of that. You three, he pointed to the trio of clones who'd just spoken out. You're in charge of techniques. I'm expecting at least 6 different ones in total, since we might not manage a few, as we did last time. Everyone who has suggestions, talk to these 3 after the meeting. All the hands went down as the blonde genin finished his proclamation. Any other details? You should practice summoning more. Everyone turned toward Ishibo, who was standing on Aruko's head. We're listening, Naruto replied for the group. From what I heard, one of the main issues at first was the fact that you were stuck underground, and that your earth-moving technique wasn't enough to make an exit. Nods all around. Well, earth specialists are common in the Bunny clan among those that practice ninjutsu. Summoning one of those would have made escaping a lot easier. Naruto couldn't deny that. I have to agree with the rabbit here, Jiraiya added from his seat. If you're gonna be the rabbit sage one day, you need to know the clan you've joined. Who are the rabbits and what are their talents? Who should you call in specific situations? I'll take care of that, Aruko said, raising her hand. I'm the one who spends the most time with Ishibo outside. Might as well make something out of it. Can you bleed? Another clone at the table pointed out. A second later, Aruko's hand went back down as her face lowered. I'll have to take care of that one myself. Aruko, if you can go over the members of the rabbit clan with Ishibo before I start summoning them, that would already be helpful. Both the female clone and the rabbit nodded in approval. The boy then looked around. Anything else anyone wants to bring up? A recommendation, if you will, the Sun Dame said. Go ahead. The man rose. Since number aren't an issue, I'd suggest that there should always be a clone team close in case you need support. That way, if you 3 are taken out by surprise, a rescue group is at least close at hand. Yeah, Naruto said, dejected. I'd thought about that also. He didn't like the fact that he'd made things worse with bad decisions. Remember one thing, Iruka spoke up as he saw Naruto's face. You made it through. Sure, there were wrong choices and questionable actions, but the important part is that you made it, and can learn from it. He waved around. There isn't anybody here who never made a bad decision. That's just being human. But as long as it helps you improve, it's already that much earned, he said with a smile. He wasn't the only one. Both Jiraiya and Hiruzen nodded at that, similar smiles on their lips. Nothing more. Naruto finally said after a moment. Meeting adjourned. We'll be expecting reports from everyone on their tasks next week. Dismissed. The three adults instantly vanished, being clones, while the rest of the group quickly made their way downstairs. Naruto wasn't far behind. If he hurried, he might manage to reach Ishiraku before Tiki closed shop. 11 days without Ishiraku ramen had been more than enough fasting, and he had a date with the largest bowl he could find. Prank Day 184. Uzumaki, a voice said, coming from right behind him. Naruto turned away from his ramen to find Uchiha Sasuke coming his way. He nearly replied his usual term, but suddenly realized his former rival had actually used his name and not one of insults he usually bandied about. Uchiha, he finally replied, unsure of what else to say. The dark-haired boy took that as an invitation, and sat down beside him at the counter. He even ordered a plate of tomatoes as he did so. Now even more confused, he released a burst of chakra, hoping to break whatever illusion he was under. No such luck. Just back from your first C rank from what I've heard, correct? Sasuke said between two slices of tomato. The great Uchiha doing normal conversation. Impossible. Naruto had to force himself not to check that the sky was falling. He simply nodded instead, taking another bite of his noodles. How was it for you? The Uchiha asked. For a second, Naruto didn't know what to say. The happenings in Fumotocho hadn't yet been released to the general public, and there was enough information under seal that he didn't know what to answer. You had your own C ranks, so I'm pretty sure you know the drill by now, he evasively replied instead. Sasuke looked up to the sky. Long, boring and seemingly pointless. Naruto simply nodded, even though it hadn't been anything like that. I hear you. Naruto finished his bowl in silence while Sasuke snacked beside him. He was pretty sure this meeting wasn't a coincidence, and he wanted to get at the bottom of it. Thank you for the meal, he said to Iam as he pushed back his bowl on the counter. Are you busy after this? Sasuke asked as soon as his bowl was gone. The blonde had expected a request like this one. Not particularly. He was headed down below for more training, but it wasn't anything pressing. And he was wondering what could have made Sasuke become civil out of the blue. You up for a spa? The Uchiha asked, smirking as he usually had. Naruto remembered that he'd hated that smirk, but now for some reason it didn't have the impact it had before. He thought for a moment. While he'd trained a lot, the number of people he'd sparred against was minimal. Outside his clones, only Iruka had been a frequent training partner. Add to that a few sessions with Ibisu, and that was the sum total of his sparring experience ever since he'd graduated. A new challenger might be a good reference point, especially one his age. Sure. What kind? Ninjutsu, Kenjutsu, Taijutsu. The smirk just grew. All of it. Some alarm bells started ringing in Naruto's mind. Why? He finally asked. I heard about your performance during the invasion, he answered, scowling somewhat. and that you were promoted because of it. I just wanted to know how I compared to that. Naruto was sure there was something else there, but he lost nothing in humoring his former classmate. Okay. When and where? He said, gesturing to his own lack of equipment. Sasuke thought for a moment. How about training ground 19 at 2? Naruto nodded. I'll be there. Good, Sasuke said with the slightest hint of a smile. He quickly ate the rest of his snack, paid for his meal and left. Naruto did the same. He had a little more than an hour to get ready, and he planned on being as prepared as he could. At the academy, Sasuke had always been one to go for victory at all costs, and Naruto wasn't planning on losing this one. Naruto wasn't the only one to have come prepared. The Uchiha had 2 more bandoliers of kunai and shuriken on his sides, along with what looked like a pocket full of explosive tags. He was stretching himself for left to right, preparing himself for quick movement. He stopped as soon as the blonde arrived within 4 paces of him. You need time to prepare. Naruto shook his head. He'd never need it, and he wasn't going to start now. Ready when you are, he answered with a smile. He had to agree that he was looking forward to this match. The Uchiha had won all spars they'd had at the academy, and it would be a good measure of his growth since then. Said Ninja withdrew a single kunai. We start when this touches the ground, okay? Naruto nodded. Sasuke threw the kunai high in the air, then took position. He did the same, and the two stuck to the pose for the couple of seconds it took for the kunai to reach the ground. When it did, Sasuke dashed forward instantly, then redirected his charge in an instant to come from the side. The blonde wasn't surprised, he'd done the same many times at the academy. He dodged the first 2 punches, rolled under the kick, then stepped back to evade a second one. 3 quick parries with his Bokuto followed, as Sasuke launched a trio of kunai in quick succession. It was clear Sasuke was testing him, and he was doing the same. His former rival was faster than when they'd last fought, but he had no problem in keeping up with him. My turn, Naruto said, and it was he that charged this time. He launched himself in what was basically his 4th kata, and by the 3rd strike Sasuke had a kunai in hand to block the various strikes. Naruto didn't let the pressure fall, he even tried to place a punch in the middle, as Iruka had done on him, but the dark-haired boy noticed, flipping back at the last instant. And then he was blind. Genjutsu? Naruto wondered. He'd not seen Sasuke do the seals. Still, he needed to react. He stepped to the side to dodge the 3 shuriken he could hear coming, then swiped his blade straight at Sasuke once he could hear the boy was in range. By the sound the dark-haired boy had made, he hadn't been expecting that, and had thrown himself to the side to evade. This gave him enough time to make a genjutsu dissipation seal. Kai. Nice one, Naruto said as he turned to the rising Sasuke. The Uchiha had his serious face on, and his fingers were moving into seals. Seals he recognized, and his own fingers moved to counter. Kaiten, Kakeikyuu no Jutsu. Kaiten, Akiraka Jigakuhai. The black sphere appeared just as Sasuke turned to exhale, and the flame he spat quickly vanished inside the darkness of the ball. What is that? He yelled. Like I'm gonna tell in the middle of combat, Naruto replied, shifting the sphere to his offhand and pulling his sword up once more. Had enough? The Uchiha scowled. No. He launched a brace of shuriken with his answer, and dashed toward the trees that surrounded their practice area. Like most training grounds in Konoha, Area 19 was surrounded on 3 sides by woods. Sasuke quickly disappeared into those, vanishing into the underbrush. Rushing to the edge of the forested area, Naruto stopped to listen, trying to sense his foe. As usual, Sasuke was good, there wasn't a sound out of place, and he couldn't feel his sparring partner anywhere. It was the perfect setup for an ambush or a trap. And he knew how to deal with those. Kichibunshin no Jutsu. A wave of clones rushed forward, and Naruto made sure to follow as if he was one of the many clones. His black ball changed hands to a clone on his left, and a few more Hellfire spheres appeared in the group, summoned by the clones. And that happened just in time, as a number of smaller fireballs shot outwards from deeper in the woods. "Spread out!" he yelled as two of the clones with spheres rushed forward. The flames were quickly absorbed, but the shuriken they hid weren't, and the two bunshin burst as their spheres exploded at the contact. Another wave of clones replaced them, but by now Sasuke had clearly changed position. Sasuke Uchiha forced himself not to pant as he hid in the trees, having just done a quick shunshin after a fireball. Around him, he could hear the many Naruto slowly canvassing the place, looking for his position. It had been at least 15 minutes since he'd entered the forest, and they hadn't let up. He was tiring. He knew his reserves were greater than most genin, especially after Kakashi's grueling training, but he was still running out of chakra. He was also down to 3 kunai, and less than half his tags. His shuriken were long gone, and Naruto was now wise to most of his tricks, which never worked twice. Whatever he'd thought of the boy in the past, he couldn't deny that this wasn't the dead last he'd faced at the academy. His sword work was tight and effective, even in a wooded area where obstacles were everywhere. His reactions were fast and he knew how to use his jutsu well. Even by sneak attack, his clones took 3 or 4 hits before they went down, and by now they went everywhere in teams of 3, cutting down that option. Kakashi had been right, unless they made a mistake, taking on those trios was a losing proposition. He couldn't see how he could win this one. It hurt inside to admit, but he was losing. And worse was, even if he managed to win, it would be more luck than anything, and it wouldn't satisfy him. Naruto had taken all he could deal, and had come out on top. It was. A squirrel dropped down on the branch he was hiding on, and he kicked it near instantly as he reacted. The beast disappeared in a burst of smoke, and he knew he was found. Shit. He did a quick shunshin 4 meters away, only for a quartet of what he supposed were clones to appear instantly around him. Grabbing 2 kunai, he rushed the closest, who managed to block or dodge the first 7 strikes. The 8th burst him, but he found himself surrounded by clones holding explosive tags at chest height. "You're out," Sasuke Naruto's voice came from deeper in the woods. Fubaku Hojin. He didn't know the technique, but the armed tags were bad enough. He supposed he had enough for another pair of shushin, but outside of that he was dry. And he didn't think he could manage a reversal. "I surrender," he spat out, grimacing. He let his kunai drop from his hands as he said so. The clones did a couple of seals before removing the tags, and they stepped back as another Naruto came forward. "Good spar," the Naruto said, and Sasuke suspected it was the original. "I lost," the Uchiha spat out, as if it explained everything. "Yeah, and?" Naruto countered. "I know I learned a lot from this spar. That hiding shuriken in fireballs trick, it was great, and you might have gotten me with it if you'd used it earlier." "Good for you," the Uchiha growled out. "You can't tell me you learned nothing from this spar," Naruto countered. "Yeah, like what?" Sasuke said, looking down at his training partner. said Blonde, raised a single finger. Well, you at least know what to work on. First, you clearly need better endurance, he pointed out, then raised a second finger. Your speed at hand seals is good, so a quick jutsu for close range would be a good addition. Third finger. Some trap training might be useful, also. It probably wouldn't have worked on me, since it's one of my specialties, but you could have made that forest a lot more difficult to hunt you in, and your talent with wires makes it a natural progression of your skill set. Fourth. Some blind fighting training might be useful, also. I could tell you used mostly your eyes for sensing, and since you're an Uchiha that's a big flaw. That's all. Sasuke replied, clearly unhappy. And where would I find such a jutsu? Well, your sensei is Kakashi of 1,000 jutsu, so I'm pretty sure he has at least one or two that fit those criteria, Naruto countered. Now, you want another match? Sasuke replied, ambling away from the training ground, going straight for home. He didn't need to be hammered into the ground once more and, judging by how tired he was, he wouldn't be giving his best anyway. See you, then, Naruto replied cheerfully. Come again for another spar someday. Yeah. His head was down and he was stuck in his thoughts all the way back to the Uchiha district. He felt like he'd fallen back miles from being ready to face his brother. If the so-called dead last could beat him after less than a year, how much behind was he, and how could he ever catch up to Itachi? Clearly, Kakashi wasn't helping him improve fast enough if Naruto could have so easily passed him. He needed more. But, who else could he go to for training? Prank Day 187. Tora sat down on the pillow reserved for him in the underground chamber that Jin Shippo never left. Behind him were the rest of the leaders of the Torazen, each seated in his own spot. Before him, on her throne-like chair, was the Lord Jin herself, with her two most loyal retainers beside her. So the Lord said, her voice firm. How goes our people? There. Tora started, his head bowed. There hasn't been a change, Jin-sama. While the Torazen have been guarding the city and there have been no serious altercations. A few drunks here and there. The people are still fearful and reticent. Shops are empty at near all times, and the streets are deserted. It is clear that they don't believe the Yakuza are gone, only that this is the calm before the storm, and they hide as if it was soon to come. Outside of the Yakuza themselves being captured, I do not think this will change any time soon. Disappointing, the Lord replied. And how goes finding them? We do have some leads, Jin-sama, but everything points toward the bulk of our enemies not being in the city at the moment, Tora replied. Moreover, we've heard rumors of a meeting, which might explain why they are gone. There were infiltrators as rats and mice in the few shops they'd discovered were Yakuza fronts, but these were nearly abandoned with only a few members still inside, and no one that could be termed leadership. There are a few businesses that we've identified as Yakuza fronts, but these are silent as any, and we've found nothing illegal when searched. Any person we could use as a source of information? She asked. Tora shook his head. None, Jin-sama. Whoever was left behind is either an unmarked member or hired help, and wouldn't be high enough in the ranks to have important information. So we are waiting. Sadly, yes, Jin-sama, Tora answered. There is no crime we can crack down on in the city, and outside sending troops to seek our enemies, there is not much more we can do. Shippo inclined her head. Should we do that? No, Tora instantly replied, shaking his head. The members of the Torazen behind him did the same, echoing his thoughts. It may be exactly what our enemies are waiting for. Like the population of the city, I do not believe this is over. Splitting our forces would only help our enemies if they returned. He didn't say that they'd already done exactly that. While the official members of the Torazen stayed in Jincho, there were Naruto clones going all over the peninsula. Numbers were their strength, and they'd use it as much as possible. It hadn't given any results yet, but they were sure it would. Question was, would it be in time? Prank Day 190. Gaara knew the nighttime desert better than anyone else. His insomnia had made it so that he'd lived long hours after sunset simply appreciating the solitude of the sands. He knew the sounds of the desert wind better than the words of his own father. He could tell much simply by being there and listening. That was how he knew he had company. And who that company was, specifically. "Hello, Naruto," he called out, his eyes closed. "Hello yourself," Gaara the clone replied. Gaara knew very well this wasn't the real one, but he had no reason to treat him otherwise. Simple relaxation or training this time? The Konoha genin asked. Training, the Ichibi's jailer replied, raising a sand clone from the ground. A ninja must always strive to better himself, must he not? He didn't say that he'd recently been put on the short list of possible candidates to replace the Yondaime Kazekage. He didn't know how his friend would take it, with his own ambitions. "Mind if I watch?" the clone asked. Gaara shook his head. "I told you I didn't mind your presence, and I am not practicing anything particularly dangerous today." "Just verifying," Naruto replied, sitting down. Gaara spent the next hour building sand clones, both singularly and in groups. The Naruto clone was now a Kweityu, and they were training in their own way. 3 were juggling those black spheres Gaara had seen before, while the last was watching his own training. "Are you always training your sand, Gaara?" that clone finally asked. The sand boy nodded. "It is what I am best at," he countered. "Yeah, but it can't be useful in all the situations," the Kichibunshin replied. "Like, if you're fighting at sea, or something. Or against attacks that can go through your defenses," another clone pointed out as he caught and sent back a trio of balls. Gaara had to admit he'd never thought about it. He'd rarely been sent outside the village, and never for longer than during the recent Chunin exam. And within the desert, he was deadly at every range. "Are you sure?" He couldn't think of his reliance on sand as a weakness. Even in Konoha, there was enough sand around him that he could gather the equivalent of his gourd in a few moments, if necessary. "Sure. I had my own wake-up call about relying on a limited number of techniques," he replied, not saying anything more. Gaara thought for a moment, reviewing his time in Konoha mentally. He didn't remember much of the time after he'd tried releasing the Ichibi, but he knew that the boy who'd been fighting him hadn't been defeated, having retreated instead after a long battle. But the time before that was clear, and painful. He'd been a punching bag for the Konoha genin, having neither the speed nor the strength to do anything but take the blows. If training in a different way could prevent such a situation from happening again, he was all for it. "What do you recommend?" he asked, stepping up to where the clones were. The 4 clones looked at each other for a moment and nodded in concert. The many spheres were caught and burst on purpose, feeding the flames inside into the last remaining ball. "Any specifics?" the clone said, rising. "None that come to mind." He thought for a moment. "Your sand skin is automatic and doesn't need anything to remain active, right?" he asked. Gaara shook his head. "Not as far as I know." I've had it since forever, and before you came around, I've never had it taken off. Good, he said. Then, I'd recommend starting with exactly what Rock Lee used, taijutsu. That surprised the Suna child. Why that in particular? Well, first, it's clearly not something you've put much attention in. Gaara nodded at that, as he couldn't really deny it. And with better speed and endurance, everything one trains in gets better. But what really makes taijutsu interesting for you is that you already have an advantage over most people in the form of your natural armor. Also, another clone pointed out, with your current skill set, staying at a distance from you gives you the advantage, unless they have armor-piercing, long-range attacks. So, most people would rush to close range, hoping to take control over the battle's rhythm and stop you from using your sand. Improving your taijutsu would give you a much better chance to survive encounters like those. Gaara thought for a moment, then nodded. It made sense. How should I go about it? You haven't learned a style at your academy? Naruto asked. Academy? He countered. Never mind, the clone replied, stepping opposite to Gaara. We'll simply see where you're at. A spa, with no jutsu, no weapons, no sand. He took a combat posture. I'll be on the defensive first. Come at me. It took a moment before Gaara understood what the Naruto Bunshin meant. The following charge was weak, and his blows weren't anything to write home about. A lot of people had said of Naruto's original style that it was the one of a street brawler, but Gaara's wasn't even that. It was like he had no clue how to hurt people with his hands and feet. The only good thing Naruto could say about his fellow Jinchuriki was that he didn't tire, hitting and hitting without stopping. Clearly, they had their work cut out for them. Prank Day 192. Good day, students. Ibisu said cheerfully, which was a complete contrast to his appearance. He had a black eye and a sizable bruise on the opposite side of his face. Today we will be starting on a new form of training. The etiquette training is done, then? Naruto asked. He might understand its use more now than before, but that didn't make it any more interesting. The special Jonin shook his head. No, this will be added to our training schedule and not replace any of our current subjects. And what is this new training? Myomaru asked. Elemental ninjutsu, Ibisu exclaimed. Nice. Naruto exclaimed, only to be silenced by a hand sign from his teacher. More specifically, he explained. We will be finding out what is each of your elemental affinities and, as such, what form of elemental ninjutsu you can use. Iruka raised her hand. Can't everyone use every type of element? The Naruto clone knew jutsu of each type, and while it had taken time to master them, they could indeed use them all. Ibisu nodded. Indeed, it is possible to learn jutsu of every element. However, people tend to have a particular ease with one or more forms of elemental shaping. He looked at the three in turn. For genin like you three, it is better to start learning with the element that will come the easiest. And, how is this training done? Myomaru asked. First, this Ibisu said, withdrawing a set of small paper sheets from one of his pockets. He then handed each of the genin one. How does that work? Naruto asked, looking from one side of the sheet to the other. Not like that, he said, taking Naruto's hand. He then placed the paper square right on his palm. Now, channel some chakra into the paper. Naruto did as ordered, and, slowly but surely, the paper cut itself down the middle. Is that normal? Naruto asked. Ibisu nodded. It is one of the possible results of this exercise, the special Jonin explained. The paper cutting itself like this means that your primary elemental affinity is with wind. He scratched his chin. I am surprised, I have to admit. Based on your black sphere jutsu, I would have expected you to be of a fire nature. Wind is the very opposite of fire, and the rarest element to be found within Konoha's borders. Myoru gulped at those words. If wind was Naruto's base element, then the two of them as Kichibunshin would probably have the very same. And if it was the rarest here, 3 people on the same team with that element would clearly indicate something was going on. Iruka just smiled toward Myoru as if she knew what he was thinking and stepped up to their teacher. She put the paper in her palm, and focused. Instantly, the paper started wrinkling. That means? She asked. This is the result when used by someone with affinity with lightning techniques, Ebisu said with a nod. He then turned toward his last student. And you, Myoru? The boy racked his head for a second, trying to find a solution, when he understood what Iruka had done. He put the paper in his hand, and focused as if he was trying to feed flame into one of their spheres. The paper instantly ignited and turned to ash. Fire, I suppose. He said, hoping that another result wasn't expected. Indeed, he replied. I must say, I have a very offensively minded team. Why is that? Iruka asked. These 3 particular elements are well known to be used mostly offensively, especially compared to the other 2 who are mainly defensively oriented, he explained. In particular, the wind element has numerous cutting techniques, as well as wind blasts at longer ranges. Fire is self-explanatory, as combustion is naturally damaging, and lightning techniques are well known for their armor-piercing properties. Now, gather round. We'll go over how each element interacts with the others. Prank Day 196. Okay, so that's it for the Spy Network, Naruto said, turning toward the other side of the table. Anybody have anything else to add on the subject? Silence was the only answer. Jiraiya had to admit he liked being part of these council meetings. Being made near entirely of clones, there wasn't the usual politics and manipulations inherent with humans trying to one-up each other for hierarchy purposes. Here, the hierarchy was clear, and no one tried to put himself forward for more credit or to protect himself. As such, he'd made sure to have a clone present at every meeting since he'd been invited. Watching his godson slowly become an important part of the Leaf military system was something he wouldn't have missed for the world. It was also a breath of fresh air compared to the other meetings Hiruzen had brought him to. So, techniques, the Real, Naruto said, turning and pointing to a trio of Bunshin on his left side. Your show. We're still going through everything, the middle one said, rising. Our primary selection of techniques got us 23 possibles, and we're currently going over. He then stopped, his face blanking up for a moment. In fact, Jiraiya noticed, that particular clone wasn't the only one. Every Naruto's face had instantly frozen. What? They exclaimed as one. Jiraiya had no clue what, but something had clearly just happened. He supposed a clone had just burst or sent a message, and said message wasn't anything good. What's happening? The many Narutos ignored him, rushing out of their chairs. One even transferred himself across the room with a kawarimi, and he had the door halfway open when Naruto interrupted everyone. Stop! He yelled, updating everyone with a hand seal. All the clones obeyed, stopping instantly. What are you saying? One of the council members countered. It was clear from Naruto's face that he was holding himself back from doing something violent. His hands were gripping the table tightly, and Jiraiya could feel the strength of his godson's chakra lashing out. We already have a clone present and helping. More of us won't be much of a help. He turned toward Jinii. You're the one here closest to him from the merchant network, correct? Jinii nodded. Go. Find out what you can. The merchant jumped out of his seat and ran out. What's happening? The Sunday masked. Jiraiya had to admit he was also curious. He'd never seen Naruto so angry. He turned to the Hokage, face blank. Ishiraku is burning, he answered simply, his voice filled with wrath. When Jinii arrived, the fire was at least under control. He could see a couple of clones with black spheres inside, keeping the flames from advancing. As such, he went directly toward Ki, who was standing with his daughter on the side of the road. Are you and I am okay? He asked. He had a flashback of earlier this year, when these same positions were reversed. He liked it even less than last time. Tsuki didn't look at him, keeping his eyes on the still burning Ishiraku ramen. I'm fine. I am too. The restaurant, however. Tsuki didn't need to continue. It was clear that the building was a near complete loss. You have insurance, at least. Jinii seemed to remember that the building was insured from one of the many conversations the two had about their respective businesses. No, the chef replied sadly. My insurance company changed hands recently, and my coverage was suspended pending an investigation of the building. Jinii scowled. After what had happened to the warehouse with his own goods, he didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Especially not after a dozen or so customers cancelled their own orders in the last few weeks. A pair had even closed, and he'd not thought of checking into the reasons. He had the feeling that the false Anbu had moved into a new phase of their offensive. Anything I can do? Jinii asked. I don't know, the man finally answered. I can't. He fell to his knees. Jinii took a deep breath and forced himself not to react. To Tsuki, he was a business partner and not much more. He didn't know that one of the few safe places of his younger times was burning right before him. Contact me if there's anything I can do. You know I have contacts. He put one hand on Tsuki's shoulder and one on Iam's. You'll get through this. His only answer was a sad nod. The merchant clone then turned back and vanished in an alley between two buildings. He made sure he wasn't observed, and his hands flashed into the usual cross seal. Get me Nico, he called out, rage evident in his tone. There's something rotten in Konoha, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. Jiraiya curved around the burnt counters, stepping inside what was formerly Ishiraku Ramen. Most of the building by now was covered with tarps, hiding the interior. So, what happened? The Toad Hermit asked the first clone that came in sight. Fire, evidently, he said with a scowl. From what Ishiraku said, it started in the back, where spices and alcohols were stored. He tried extinguishing it, but water didn't do anything. Jiraiya didn't like the sound of that. Show me where. The clone led him deeper in the building, past a few other Naruto. There were still flames here and there, but they slowly faded, their heat drawn into spheres. Here, the clone said, pointing. The Sanin wasted no time in crouching, pressing a finger on the ground and looking at the results. He then rose and went around the room, looking at the walls above head height. It didn't take long for him to find a spot that was still wet. He tasted it. He then scowled. Mist oil, he said as he spat to the ground. Mist oil. Naruto repeated. A clever mix of oil, petrol, tar and alcohol that the Mist Ninja invented. Only they know the exact proportions, though most villages have their own version. Mist's is the most effective, the Senin explained. Unless you use massive amounts of liquid, throwing water at it is only going to spread it more. He looked around. Not something anybody can get their hands on. Any clue why someone would use it on a civilian target like Tki? He's been helping the merchant network, finding customers in Konoha, the clone replied. Most of them cancelled their orders in the last few weeks. Some of your own contacts did the same, actually, he added. Jiraiya turned toward him. That's very interesting, he replied. Can you tell me who? The clone gave him the name of 2 brothels and of a single bar in Konoha. I'll be checking on those myself, if you don't mind, the Sanin said. Go right ahead, the Bunshin replied. We have more than enough on our side to occupy ourselves. Jiraiya turned to walk out, stopping in what had been the door frame. Meeting tonight? The clone nodded seriously. Meeting tonight? Be seeing you, then. He said as he left. Tki had been a close ally of Naruto, and that for years. Jiraiya wasn't going to leave a single stone unturned on this subject. Luckily, most of his contacts were open late. He'd thought better from the owner of the Shadow's Rest, and he was going to get to the bottom of this. Prank Day 197. The atmosphere of the council room wasn't the same today. Iruka had been present yesterday when Naruto had dropped his bombshell, but he hadn't had anything he could say. While Ishiraku Ramen had been one of his favorite places to eat in, he'd never been as close to Tki as Naruto had been. He'd made sure to go and offer his condolences to the man during his lunch break, but there wasn't much he could do. Not while being head teacher at the academy. Iruka had been one of the first in, knowing the path by heart now. As such, he was present when everyone got in and took their seats. The various Naruto clones were somewhere between sad and angry as a rule, while Jiraiya was scowling at something. Only the Hokage was anything normal, and even then his usual smile at the proceeding wasn't present. Okay, Naruto said from his place as Kyuha, who was the last member in this time, fell into his chair. The blonde genin instantly turned to his right. Jinii, what happened? The merchant clone rose, and tiredness was evident in his body language. I'm pretty sure that, by now, everyone here knows what happened yesterday to Ishiraku. Nods all around, including Ishibo. We had Nico and other clones going around, both looking into what happened and the surrounding situation in Konoha. In short, along with the false Anbu from before, whoever is behind this is also buying out Konoha businesses by the dozens, and using them to put pressure on the rest, Jinii explained. Hiruzen joined Jiraiya in scowling. What kind of businesses? Jinii withdrew a sheet of paper. Here's the list. He passed it around. With 27 entries, it was well past the single dozen. Iruka looked it over, but recognized only half. They were insurance companies, banks and other such businesses. There were also a few equipment suppliers. The rest seemed mainly like import places and production facilities. Jiraiya gave the sheet a quick look, then passed it on. On my side, 3 of my contacts in Konoha reported being closed for health citations, and having problems with the inspectors. I checked to the places, and I couldn't find any issues present, he said. And I don't need to be a spy master to see something wrong there. Bribes, probably. So, You're saying someone's fighting us with money? The real Naruto asked. Essentially, Jiraiya answered. There are no rules in Konoha about buying or creating businesses, as the village tries to encourage trade and growth. And how do you fight that? Naruto asked. There are rules about ninja implication into civilian markets, Hiruzen pointed out. I'm not going to send ninja against civilians, not without any proof of treason, at least. Naruto shook his head. That's not what I meant. With money, Jiraiya replied. The same methods that are being used against you can also be used against them. Like the Akamichi did when the Shura tried buying out their restaurants. That was the first Naruto heard of something like that. Knowing what was generally the result when someone got between Choji and food, it can't have been pretty. What happened? The Akamichi pooled their money and bought them out instead, Jiraiya replied. And where they couldn't, they bought the suppliers, or opened businesses that undercut their opponents. Within a year, the Shura family was gone from Konoha, and everything they'd owned was in Akamichi hands. He looked to the full council. We have the money. Anybody here opposed to doing the same thing? The many clones shook their heads, while Jiraiya smiled viciously. Iruka sighed but said nothing, knowing that Naruto wouldn't take an attack on Ishiraku any other way. The Hokage rose, withdrawing himself from the council. This isn't a ninja issue, and as such I'll keep my hands off it. You don't agree? Naruto said, face falling. Jiraiya was the one that answered. No, he replied. As Hokage, he isn't allowed to involve him into these kind of economic affairs, at least not outside of certain situations such as wars and the like. Naruto, he said from the room's threshold. He then looked into Naruto's eyes and nodded. Good luck, he said, closing the door behind him. Silence reigned for a moment. You know that this'll draw the attention of whoever's attacking your suppliers, right? Iruka pointed out. Naruto's smile was vicious. Let them come. Prank Day 199. With the Merchant Council going into economic offensive, the call had gone for clones to gather money. They might have an enormous nest egg with Gato's resources, but Jiraiya had been clear that battles like this one were won by those who had the most means, and the Naruto clones didn't want to leave anything to chance. With most of the clones outside Konoha having jobs, there was already a steady flow of money going in. While their individual salaries weren't anything large, the sheer number of clones meant that this was still a tidy sum. And there were places where money flowed much quicker. Full house, queens over nines, for Tenko Midori. The dealer said. Anyone has better. The men around the table grumbled and folded. The dealer pushed the pot toward Midori, who added it to her already sizable winnings. She was already had more than 100,000 Ryo worth of chips, and she was still going strong. Before the last few days, the Naruto clones weren't much into gambling. While they hadn't been rich for most of their lives, money hadn't really been the issue. Finding places that would allow a Naruto to buy stuff was much more of a problem. And with the money they'd made off Gato and their trading network, even that was a thing of the past. As such, money hadn't been much of a priority. Added to that was the fact that casinos were very often depressing places. While the rich who came weren't an issue, there were always people of modest means trying to make it out through chance. And that rarely worked. Because of that, the many Narutos had only frequented casinos socially with others, and not otherwise. Operation Buyout had changed that. There were now a rotating group of clones in Tanzakugai, going from place to place and winning money. Their luck still hadn't deserted them, and the Naruto clones made millions daily in total from the casinos. Another hand? The dealer asked. Midori nodded, as did two of the men at the table, but the last pushed his chair back. I'm out. I'll take that chair, then a female voice interrupted. Good, good. The dealer said, his smile abnormally large. This table is 5-card draw, Densetsu no Kamo-sama. Will that be okay with you? Fine by me, she replied, pulling out a stack of chips. Midori didn't need to be told who that was. With Jiraiya as a sensei and after having met Orochimaru, the Bunshin had made sure to gather information about the last member of the Sannin, Tsunade. It wasn't good reading. The female Sannin had lost much more than the other two, and had basically given up. While Naruto wasn't one to give up, he couldn't say he'd lost as much as the granddaughter of the shoe dame, and not in the way that she did. Still, she was undercover, and as such she wasn't to draw attention. She simply continued playing as if she was facing any other opponent. And continued winning. Betting against Tsunade was bizarre. She always called and never folded, even if she had a hand full of junk. Midori wasn't sure, but it also seemed like she was satisfied with losing for some reason. There were some players like that, mostly rich men and women who were here mainly for the challenge, but she didn't seem like those. It was more as if, by losing, she made sure of something. Puzzling. Tsunade also didn't give up, not before the casino closed for the night. From there she went straight to the nearest bar, and started drinking. And, the next day, she was back at the table as if nothing had happened. After the third day of such, she made an extra clone to follow Tsunade. She might be a gambler and a drunkard, but she was still one of the Sannin. And Jiraiya might be interested by what was happening to his former teammate. Prank Day 201. Tora had the night shift. As leader of the Torazen, that was what he'd selected. After the long nights he'd had canvassing Wave 4 signs of Gato, he'd not easily been able to go back to a day shift. And since he was the leader, he had the ability to decide. And nights it was. The situation in Jin hadn't changed, either for better or for worse. The tension was still there, and the former Yakuza businesses were of no use in figuring out what was happening. Worse still, the spreading network had no better idea of what was going on. Clones had spread all over the peninsula, and no sign of the missing Yakuza had been found. In fact, outside the Jin region, there was no organized crime of any kind, something that the many Narutos found surprising. Normally, things like that spread from place to place. Here, it was limited only in Jin. The night shift also had a specific advantage: he could train more easily. After a few days, the Jin retainers had gotten accustomed to the presence of the Torazen, and had left most of the security issues to those specialized in it. Their lack of numbers had helped. By the time the Torazen had arrived in Jin, there were barely a dozen of them left. Being alone at night meant that those on the guard shift could practice techniques that no samurai should have knowledge of. Each of those guarding had their own peculiar aspect they were training in. Tora, on his side, was trying to mix kenjutsu with the sharp fist. Channeling chakra down his blade was still something he didn't have down, but he was at least making progress. Well, he was until a scream interrupted his training. He reacted instantly, opening the door and dashing inside. He didn't hesitate, going straight toward the sound, while the two others present stood in the door, blocking the only path out of the room. No, no, no. He could hear Lord Jin yell out. He didn't stop a moment, barreling behind the screen that separated her throne room from her bedroom. No. He arrived at Lord Jin's bedside with sword drawn, ready to cut whoever it was that was attacking in half. Only, there was nobody. No. Lord Jin continued screaming, clearly having a nightmare. Daddy, no. Tora sheathed his sword and sat Caesar beside the Lord's bed. Wake up, Lord Jin, he said softly. You are having a nightmare. That didn't stop her. After 3 similar tries, he shook her shoulder lightly, hoping to break her out of her nightmare. She reacted instantly, jumping back as if she was attacked, eyes wide. Tora withdrew his hand and bowed. I am sorry for my presumption, but you were having a nightmare, Jin-sama. It took a moment before she was able to calm herself and return her breathing to normal. Yes, she finally said. My thanks, Tora-san. He bowed again. I will leave you to your sleep, then. He then rose. Would it be possible for you to stay? She quickly asked. If that is what you wish, Jin-sama, Tota replied. Let me just send your other guards back to their post. He did as he said, quickly messaging the 2 remaining clones of what was happening with hand signs. He then returned to Jin-sama's bedside. What can I do for you, Jin-sama? While we are alone here, you may call me Shippo, Tora-san, she replied. I wouldn't be so presumptuous, Tora replied. It was what he expected a samurai should answer. My father the Lord Jin had a saying, Tora-san, the Lord replied, sniffing. All are equal before sickness, dreams, and to the Shinigami. While I am in my bed like this, treat me as one of your men. I would much prefer it. If that is your will, Shippo-sama, Tora replied. I must say that your father was a wise man. Better, at least, Shippo replied. And yes, he was, she said, her face downcast. How about your own, Tora-san? She asked, clearly trying to change the subject. I never knew him, Shippo-sama, he replied. From what I heard, he died very shortly after my birth. It was the truth, at least as far as he knew. And he supposed he could be true for anyone, not only ninja. I'm sorry, Shippo replied. For bringing up such painful memories. Tora shook his head. No worries, Shippo-sama, he answered. I've long gotten over the fact that I will never know my parents. Shippo's eyes went wide. Parents? Both. Tora nodded. So, you also were raised by retainers, I suppose. Something like that. Tell me your story, Shippo asked. Well, he said, building the story he was going to tell in his mind. It all started on an unlucky day, as a monster attacked our village on the day I was brought into the world. Both my father and mother were warriors, and as such they fought. It was a mix of bits of the stories he'd heard of the many samurai under his command, along with a retelling of his life in Konoha where ninja were replaced by samurai. Actually, some of the parts fit abnormally well. Having Sasuke as a snobbish samurai from a major clan who ended up losing his family to a traitor, Iruka as a strict but warm swordsmanship teacher, and the Hokage as the wise and old shogun, past his prime but still to be reckoned with, seemed just right. Shippo fell asleep halfway through his time at the academy. Tora simply smiled and tucked her in. Sasuke had been someone who'd been serious all the time, and look at what he was now. Talented he was, but there was still something clearly wrong with him. He was glad to see that Shippo could at least put the burden away for a few hours. Still, he kept in place and guarded her bed. He'd at least be there if she had another nightmare. And she needed the sleep. Prank Day 204. Welcome, Hokage-sama. The man beside the table said, bowing deeply. I wasn't expecting your august person to come to this meeting. The Sundame nodded slightly. Rise. I am still allowed, am I not? He looked around. Is my Takado-san absent? The merchant rose. Of course you are welcome, Hokage-sama. He replied. As for my Takado-san, he tends to arrive at the last minute to these proceedings. He looked around, unsure. Do you have anything to bring to the council? Hiruzen shook his head. No, no. I am just spectating today. After the invasion, I was much too busy to do so, and I wish to make sure that Konoha's economy is still running smoothly, regardless of the setbacks. Of course it is, Hokage-sama. The man replied. He then looked to the left of the Hokage. I suppose this is your latest secretary, Sundame-sama. Sarutabi nodded. Indeed she is. This is Zuya, and she'll be taking notes while the meeting goes on. The village leader looked around. Is this everyone? Save my Takado-san, yes, the council member replied. Seems much smaller than I remember, the Hokage noted. I do not see the Akamichi and Nara members, either. It is, Hokage-sama, the man replied, lowering his head. The invasion hurt us all. As for our esteemed ninja members, they have unfortunately not survived the battle with Sand and Sound. You are planning on inducting new members, correct? His eyes went around the room once more. From what I remember, you barely have quorum right now. The council member nodded. Indeed we are. This is actually one of the points being discussed today. We have a number of candidates which are still being evaluated. Please forward my secretary copies of the relevant documents, the Hokage ordered. I want to look them over before anyone is sworn in. We wouldn't an enemy agent to manage to get a hand on Konoha's finances, right? With pleasure, Hokage-sama, the man said with a wide smile. Hiruzen then sat down, and his conversation partner did the same, the discussion clearly over. My Takado arrived less than a minute later. He and Sarutabi talked for a few moments, then he took his spot as the meeting started. The Naruto clone disguised as Zuya noted as much as she could, which was made easy by the fact that everyone was calm and that no one talked over each other. Still, the meeting was a boring 3 hours long, with various council members arguing over minutiae and others clearly not caring much about what was happening. One even seemed to be sleeping behind an open ledger. In fact, there was a nagging feeling in the back of Zuya's mind that wouldn't go away. Still, the meeting came to an end as the dinner hour came, and the various merchants made their way out in turn. The Hokage did the same, Zuya right behind him, and the two returned directly to the Hokage's office. So, what do you think? The Hokage asked once they were back behind the office's privacy seals. Is it just me, or did the whole meeting seem rehearsed? Zuya asked. Sarutabi shook his head. It's not only you, he replied. It's been that way as far as I can remember, at least ever since your birth. And the guy sleeping? The Hokage smiled. Does it every time, without fail? His face then turned serious. I want you to go over all the documents you have here, along with the ones in this scroll. He pointed to a meter-high scroll that had been placed beside the man's desk. It contains copies of all the documents I received from the Merchant Council. I do not know if they are simply incompetent or are actually going against Konoha laws, but it is clear there is something not right here. Since you're already investigating what happened to Ishiraku, and since this is probably connected, I'm putting you in charge of this. With what Jire's been teaching you, you should be able to get to the bottom of this, and you can put more trusted eyes on this than I could ever find. Hi, Hokage-sama. Zuya said, saluting. Dismissed then Sarutabi said with a nod and a smile. Godspeed on your search, Genin. Prank Day 206. As was usually the case during the evenings, Naruto, Iruka and Myoru were underground in the Urahara tunnels, training. Sure, they had clones above pretending to be them, or being them, as the case were, but the originals were down here trying new things away from prying eyes. As was said during the last meeting of those in the know, Myoru's task was all about doing techniques seamlessly. And, as it turned out, this wasn't something easily done. At first, he'd tried to go at it alone, as Naruto clones often did, but after a few days without results, he'd enlisted Iruka's help in managing such a thing. While the Chunin had never mastered such a thing, he knew how it was performed from his own time as a genin. And it was all chakra control. One controlled his inner energies the same way the had seals did, only without doing them. Easier said than done. The thing was, while the clones were, for some reason, better at chakra control than the real Naruto was, they were still pants at it. They had visible proof with their various attempts at a normal bunshin. They still needed more than 6 clones at the time to have real valid ones. There were chakra control exercises, true, but by now the ones the Naruto clones knew they could do by heart, and weren't getting much out of them. Gaara has actually added one to the list recently, one that was practiced in Suna, that allowed someone to walk over sand, or earth, or pretty much anything else, without leaving tracks. There were actually a few dozen clones practicing kenjutsu using the method, and being forced to start their katas over if they left any trace behind. Myoru, however, wasn't doing that, or another version of the exercise. He was training the Kawerimi. The Kawerimi was, outside possibly the shadow clone, the technique they knew the best. The reason for that was simple. There were, at any time, dozens of Kichibunshin warping around the elemental nations using this technique. This familiarity was one of the reasons why he'd selected it. The other reason was its enormous potential once mastered. As Naruto had said to Konohamaru and his group, the replacement technique was a very efficient dodging method, and with Shadow Clone being as solid as they were, dodging was something they needed to do a lot of. Not that he'd been advancing much. The male clone had tried various things during the past week and a half, all without success. As such, he'd taken a page from Naruto's book, and started going at it the completely opposite way. He was doing the hand seals, all of them instead of simply the last one, and doing so as slow as he possibly could and still succeed. It was already helping quite a bit, since doing it slowly made the changes he forced on his chakra only more evident. It wasn't something that he could really describe, as he could not find valid words to express what he felt his chakra doing, but he could still track it and feel it. And, hopefully, replicate it. It took him a good 2 hours to have the pattern down, during which Naruto and Iruka behind him summoned 3 rabbits he'd never heard of. He forced himself to ignore that, and focused on his own work. Managing to transform his chakra properly to perform the technique took another hour, and that was when going at the slowest possible speed. Even there, taking 2 minutes a hit, it would be useful, as it already was something better than all the rope escape tricks they'd been taught at the academy. And, most of all, the Naruto clones were very good at getting incremental improvement out of practice. Myoru moved to an emptier region of the Urahara basement, leaving Naruto and the bunnies behind, and summoned as many shadow clones as he could once there. There was an instant nod between them, and they turned to improving their kawarimi. It might be 2 minutes now, but they'd shave that down in time. That's what they were best at. Prank Day 209. Jinii was a man on a mission. Konoha normally had dozens of clones running around under different disguises, and Ishiraku burning down had only increased their numbers. All of the merchant network's suppliers and customers were under watch, and that even in Leaf Village. That was how they'd learned that Ishiraku, one of Naruto's precious people, was out in the streets, looking for work. On one hand, that didn't surprise Naruto. Taki certainly couldn't work at Ishiraku until it was rebuilt. But the man was clearly having issues, if his face was any indication. He'd already done a dozen different restaurants, and judging by his actions he wasn't having much luck there. Now, while Naruto wanted to help, as himself, he couldn't really officially offer the man a job. Sure, he had money to spare, even with the amounts he was pouring into running Konoha's merchant council into the ground, but Taki would never accept it from him. From a fellow businessman, however, as an investment. Jinii stopped before the restaurant in front of him. It wasn't one he, or any other Naruto clone, had even been to, but the okonomiyaki place was, from what he understood, a respectable one. No reason to be rude and go inside. Not when waiting gave the same results. Taki came out before 10 minutes were done, and it was clear he still hadn't found anything. He had a face Naruto knew well, the mix of tired resignation and hard-headed perseverance he'd put forward for a long time before he'd passed the academy. "Good day, Ishiraku-san." "Good day, Jizia-san," the man replied. "I'm sorry to say, but I have to get going. I have a lot of other places to." Jinii stopped him with a raised hand. "Correct me if I am wrong, Ishiraku-san, but I heard you were looking for a job." The ramen chef straightened. "I am. Would you be open to working with me?" the clone asked. You have a restaurant?" Taki replied, surprised. "That's the first I've heard about it." Jinii shook his head. "I don't," he quickly countered. "I would be hiring you for your other talents." "Which are?" Taki asked. "Walk with me, if you will," Jinii answered. "We should discuss things in a more private environment." Taki simply nodded and followed. The two talked of less serious subjects on the way, if the state of Ishiraku ramen could be defined that way. It seemed the ramen chef did not have much luck with getting the necessary loan to get his business going again, mainly because he was currently out of work. Which was the reason why he was hitting the streets for a job. Jinii led Taki to the back room of the Kuroniko shop, where a half-dozen other people were waiting. They were all Naruto clones, not that Taki had any idea of that, but they were all bunshin assigned to the merchant network in Konoha, or working in related fields. Each introduced himself in turn, though Jinii was the one who introduced his supposed wife, after which everybody took a seat. "You still haven't told me what you would hire me for," Taki pointed out to Jinii. The clone simply nodded. "I, along with everyone in this room, are planning on breaking the monopoly that the Konoha Merchant Council are trying to get." Taki's eyes widened, and he looked around, only to see grim faces answering him. The clones didn't need to act for that. The simple idea that someone would ham Ishiraku ramen was an anathema to them. "As much as I agree with the idea," Taki replied, "I don't see what a Ryo-less chef could do to help." "We need someone from Konoha," Nico replied from his spot at the table. "We need someone who knows the people, the businesses, the culture. Everyone else around this table." He waved his hands. "Are too recently arrived in Konoha to do the work. We need someone who can be the face of this project, someone Konoha knows and respect. And we think you can be that man. And, you have to money for such an undertaking? Taki asked, unsure. A project like this one might take years to see to fruition, and could cost billions of ryo. You have that kind of money? Ishiko, who was the third of the original merchant clones in charge of Konoha, was the one to answer. Money is no object, not now. Not when there are people dead because of this. Taki moved back in surprise. People dead, you mean that there have been assassinations because of this? Everyone else nodded sadly. Jinii rose. We are being very serious with this. We have the means and the will, now we simply need the people. And you're at the head of the list of those that can help. Why me? He asked. You're a long-time Konoha citizen, Jinii explained, and you know how the businesses work. You have contacts that can help, and you know who's dangerous. Moreover, you need a job, and with what the Konoha Merchant Council did to your business, I'm sure you have no love for them. Are you sure it was them? Taki asked with a small voice. Jinii shook his head. 100% sure. No, he replied. But the timing is pretty indicative, as it was for all the other events. One is luck, twice is coincidence, but their times is enemy action. And we are long past 3 separated events. We simply have no concrete proof, or we'd be going to the Hokage with this. Taki was silent for a moment. And, my shop. As a gesture of good faith, we'll finance the repairs of Ishiraku Ramen. Either then or buying you a new place to work from, equipment and all. If Ishiraku Ramen was a thorn in the council's side, we want it to stay. Could I have this in writing? The ramen chef asked. Jinii nodded, and brought out the necessary papers. There was the requisite arguing over terms and salaries, but not much, as the Naruto clones had no issue with paying Taki as much as he wanted, and weren't trying to get one over him. The man read the final version twice, then signed the 3 copies at the bottom. The contracts then went around collecting the remaining signature from the other clones. Welcome aboard, Ishiraku-san, Nico said. The man shook his head. If we're going to be working together, call me Taki. I'd be much more happy with that. Ishiko and Jinii nodded. The same for me. Welcome to the network, the latter said. Glad to be here. Prank Day 209. Natagama was the clone now in charge of tracking Tsunade. That wasn't the only thing he did, as he also hit the casinos for money along with his target, but that was his main job. And it wasn't as easy as it might seem. The first 2 days had gone well. He'd switched disguises and identities a dozen times over the days, alternating between male and female, and Tsunade hadn't seemed to be getting any hint. Then, one night while halfway drunk, she'd turned around and blanched. And she was gone the next minute. It was sheer luck that Natagama had managed to catch on her trail, even with all the clones he'd produced. She was clearly going more for speed than for stealth, going directly toward her next target without deviating. That actually allowed the clones to preempt her there, and to keep watch without being too suspicious. There, she returned to her usual routine, with casinos in the day and bars in the night. Then, 3 days later, she did the very same. This time, Natagama was sure his clone group wasn't the one who'd sparked her escape. None of them had even been within sight of her, preferring to keep away and observe from farther. Still, she ran out in the middle of the night, her apprentice and her pet pig right behind her. This time, the group had been ready, and they'd had people in every city with 100 miles that had either a casino or a place to take bets. The group had been thinking about approaching her and talking things over, but that now seemed a pipe dream. She clearly had more issues than the group had expected. Still, they'd keep watching. Maybe they'd learn more by doing so. Prank Day 211. Originally, the Naruto clones hadn't infiltrated Konoha as they had the other cities in their path. That hadn't seen it as useful. The real Naruto was living there without the need for any disguise or trickery, and they already had numerous clones legally into the town. Further infiltration was seen as pretty pointless, with the numbers they already had access to. Then Ishiraku burned down, and everything changed. There was one thing that became certain: they had enemies in Konoha itself, and they needed information about their foes. One of the primary targets was the company that Tiki had dealt with for insurance, as the timing made it pretty evident that there was something wrong happening there. It took barely a week before the Kijibunshin managed to get someone inside. The company had already been recruiting, since they were somehow growing regardless of the invasion, and the network sent clones there under different guises and histories until one finally got in. It wasn't in any important position or anywhere with power, basically being a gopher for more important people, but it was perfect for what the Narutos wanted. Gophers had access to the archives, since they came and went with documents, and often worked long hours after the place was closed and the bosses were gone. Regardless of how it was when the leaders of the company were present, the atmosphere relaxed quite a bit once the lower-ranked staff were the only people remaining. And, with everyone in a hurry to leave, the Naruto clone in the building had no difficulty being the last there. He'd made sure to work at half speed just to have work remaining on purpose, simply to have a reason to stay behind before hitting the bars with the rest of the group. Between Nanaboa's genjutsu, dozens of shadow clones copying documents and an easy access to the sewers, the group had copies of every documents the company had on site. Going through them all wasn't the job of a few hours, but against that the Naruto clones could do what they did best, that is throw numbers at it. And that's what they did, with hundreds of bunshin down in the Urahara basement going over everything sheet by sheet. Ishiraku's former contract was quickly found and analyzed. He'd been with that company for years, and his last insurance request was dated 2 weeks after Naruto's own birth. Just the date would have been enough. It was clear what had caused him to go to his insurance company. Nothing outside of that. He'd had regular inspections twice a year, with notices going long in the past. Outside of small details here and there, nothing jumped out as a warning flag. Then, 2 days before Naruto's birthday, the company had been bought out. So far, every active account had their contracts cancelled pending inspection. There were piles of reports just from that, with 24 clones going through them meticulously. Tiki actually had an inspection planned a couple of days after the exam, which was cancelled 2 days after the invasion happened. There was nothing after that. No request for another inspection, no other paper trail. It was as if Tiki's account had fallen into the cracks. At least, it would, if it wasn't one of many accounts facing the same issue. There were dozens of people like Tiki, some still unharmed, others having fallen during the invasion. Tiki was actually the only one the Naruto clones could find that had something happen afterward. And there was something else there, something that they needed better eyes on, just to be sure. Prank Day 212. That's not just me seeing things, right? The Naruto clone asked. Jiraiya shook his head. No, it's not just you, he growled. The timing's pretty indicative. As are the other details. They had advance notice, I could bet my hand on it. By now, they had read enough that they had a good general view of the last few months, from the moment the insurance company changed hands until now. And it was clear that said company knew beforehand that the invasion was coming. The person who'd bought the company had all contracts cancelled pending a new inspection, and started doing said inspections the very next day. But only with council businesses. Are you sure those? He pointed to the pile on the side, containing the inspections made pre-invasion, are all merchant council businesses. Jiraiya fixed him with a blank look. I'm Konoha's spymaster, and this is my job. I might not have your widespread network, but the village I know like my left foot. The clone raised his hands. Withdrawn. Doing all those inspections in a little more than 4 weeks meant overtime, which was pretty easy to track in all the paperwork. It wasn't anything surprising, not with the cancellation of all contracts. It was, however, when it stopped, 3 days before the third exam. Normally, the inspections should have continued, as the company hadn't yet gone through every cancelled account, but it stopped nonetheless. What inspections were already scheduled, those not under the council's umbrella, this time, each got postponed a week or two due to what was clearly bogus reasons. And there were a good number of paid vacation days to those newly arrived in the company's leadership. Like they were going out of the village for something. Is it enough to have the Hokage bring ninja in? The first clone asked. Jiraiya shook his head sadly. Not yet, no. A Yamanaka might be able to get us more, but this doesn't fall under treason yet, which would be the only reason where the Hokage might allow it. That's not treason? The Bunshin asked. No, he said with a shake of his head. They didn't work against the Hokage's rule, and there is nothing here that proves that they helped its enemies. And there is no law forcing civilians to report this kind of information to the Hokage. Why's that? Because civilians aren't ninjas, he explained. They aren't trained in looking out for what to report, which means they can't be blamed when they fail to do so. And, if it is really someone in the Konoha hierarchy that is working against the village, they might actually have been following what they expected were valid orders. The clones scowled. Now what? You still have documents to go through. The clones nodded. Then continue with that. If they are really working against Konoha interests, you'll either manage to go down the chain until you find the source, or find something they can actually be prosecuted for. He then smiled. Or, they'll make a mistake you can pick up on, and we'll have them. Make sure I'm present whenever you storm whatever place they are working from. I want my pound of flesh, also. The clone saluted. Hi, sensei. Prank day 215. I will be going out of in the city today, Tora-san, the Jin Lord said with a smile. Please have a small escort force prepared to accompany me through the city. After their first, Tora had had many nighttime discussion with Shippo, as she expected to be called then. They'd talked of all kinds of subjects save the city's issues, which were reserved for the day. Because of that, Tora now knew the Jin Lord better than most. She wasn't close to breaking, as he'd first feared, but still felt the pressure. She'd sworn along with the rest of her family, on her father's deathbed, that they'd keep the city and the family proud and honorable, and she'd done her best to do so when it was her time on the throne. Still, that was the first he heard about her going out of the compound. It would be the first time she'd done so ever since he'd been in San no Kuni. Tora bowed. May I ask why, Jin-sama? You may, the girl answered. Today is founding day and, as tradition dictates, I will be going around the city, then visiting my ancestors' graves. Please prepare the men as such. Tora scowled, his face hidden by his position. One thing he'd learned from the night discussions was that Shipor was very traditional, as she'd not been raised with much knowledge on how to rule. Instead, she followed how things had been done before, hoping that this would be enough. He also knew that he wouldn't be able to dissuade her. I will have the men ready, Tora answered. He'd have more than her guard. This was the perfect setup for an assassination, and one that could be planned beforehand with ease. He'd have people all over the place, in disguise or not. He then turned, and left the Lord's room, going directly to the place that was given to the group to use as barracks. So, what's up? HY asked as soon as he came in, noting the clone's face. Jin Summer's going in the city today, and you're all part of the guard force, he exclaimed. Everyone scowled, then nodded. You want members at every corner, I suppose, KGA with Macron asked. Tora simply nodded. Yes. Ryan, light a fire under the Kuronico. I want to have spies over every roof and a new check of all the Yakuza buildings. I don't have to tell you, but this is the perfect ambush scenario. Everyone nodded. HY, you've been watching people practicing, right? Said Clone confirmed. I want the 20 best we have, and at least half of them warm bodies. He looked at everyone in the eyes. I need people who can take hits, not an entire group who could be taken out by lucky strikes. Hi, Taicho, HY replied, instantly running out. The rest of the group wasn't far behind. They had work to do. As was usual in Jin, the streets were empty when Shipor and her entourage finally stepped out of her mansion. Surprisingly, however, it didn't stay that way, as slowly and surely the people came out to look and see their lord among the commoners. She stopped here and there, talking to people and referring them by name, and slowly but surely the tension bled out of the atmosphere. Where, yesterday, people were scared and tense, now there were smiles and cheers. Still, the Torazen keep a firm guard over the young lord. Nobody stepped within 10 meters of Shipor, and both Tora and Ryan were ever-present shadows at her side. Still, this didn't affect the rising atmosphere. On the contrary, the samurai received many deep bows and thanks from numerous civilians. It was nice to see that the Torazen were actually appreciated, after all the work that was done. By the time the sun came down and the group reached Jincho's main graveyard, there were now dozens of civilians following with a good number of extra samurai providing protection. They split here and there toward different grave sites, each family going to their own ancestors' graves. They then started talking, as if they were explaining what had happened in the past year. So, that's what this holiday was about, Tora noted. It was easy to see where Shipor was going. In the middle of the graveyard, there was a sizable silver mausoleum that stood higher than anything else in the place. Seems not all Jin members agreed that everyone is equal before the Shinigami, Tora thought silently. Shipor stopped a dozen meters before the mausoleum, then turned to her guard. I will be going alone from here on, she exclaimed. Please wait for my return. Ryan stepped forward. Are you sure you do not want a guard inside? There may be enemies hidden in wait. Both Shipor and her retainers smiled. Then, try to reach the mausoleum, Ryan-san. If you manage to reach it, I will be glad to have your company as I go meet my ancestors. The smiles around him clearly indicated something was up, but he did as ordered nonetheless. He'd barely walked a couple of meters more that he was stopped suddenly, and couldn't go an inch forward. A barrier! He exclaimed. Indeed, said Getsuko, who had been with them the whole way. A couple of generations ago, there was an issue with grave robbers looting the fallen lord's resting place. There lived a wandering monk in the village then, and he put a barrier around the site, keeping those not members of the lord's family from entering. Tora nodded, then thought for a moment. How are the Jin members buried then? I mean, if only they can enter, it means. He started, then noticed the current lord's face. My apologies, Jin-sama. I spoke without thinking. The sadness was evident in Shippo's face. You do not need to excuse yourself, Tora-san, as you are correct. I have had to bury members of my family myself in this place, and sometimes I was alone in doing so. There was a moment of silence as everyone digested that. How long will you be, Jin-sama? KGA with Macron said, changing the subject. I should not be more than 30 minutes, KGA with Macron-san the Lord responded. You may go until then. The samurai clones looked among themselves, then nodded. We will remain here until you come out, Jin-sama Tora replied, talking for everyone. It is a samurai's job to wait patiently for his master, after all. Shippo smiled at that. Truly, I am well served. I will be seeing the Torazen once more soon, then. She then walked forward alone, and went unstopped past where Ryan had been immobilized. She then disappeared down the stairs themselves. The 4 Torazen sat in the grass before the mausoleum, and waited. 10, 20, 30 minutes passed. By then the last shards of the sunset were slowly disappearing, and the dark was reclaiming the cemetery. Many of the civilians had gone back to their home, the holiday done, but some still remained to watch the Jin Lord return. But she did not. Still, the Torazen remained calm. There might not be a way to tell time inside the tomb, and Shippo might have simply had more to tell. But when an hour had finally passed, and the dark had fully claimed the cemetery, Tora had to admit something had gone wrong. Maybe it was something benign, like the young girl falling asleep, or maybe she'd slipped and fell, and could rise back up. But there were other, darker possibilities. With a few hand signs, Tora had the cemetery cleaned out. Some of the civilians grumbled at that, but the samurai paid them no mind. Their job was the Lord's security, and this might very well be an attempt on her. 10 minutes later, the place was empty, save for members of the Torazen. Only clone members too, as they would have to show some of the skills they'd hidden. Now, it was time to stop being a samurai, and to be a ninja once more. That's it guys. Hope you like the video. Like, share and subscribe the channel, and also make sure you tell me your recommendation in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching.